got a few work-related stories from my hometown I can post. This first one happened when I was a 20-year-old college student. At the time, I worked in a, let's say, rustic-looking gas station. It wasn't a building by itself either. Rather, it acted more like a booth that was attached to a supermarket. The booth itself is located a bit off-site on the other side of this huge parking lot, but the supermarket owns it. The booth faces the store, but it has a huge woodland area directly behind it. The door to the booth faces left into the woods, and I know I'm being overly specific, but this is important. So the window in the booth is bulletproof, but only covers the front so you can't see directly to the left or right of the booth. At the time of this experience, I'd been working at the station for maybe a few months, when all of a sudden, this nasty storm hit the area one night. The rain was so bad that you could barely see 10 feet in front of you, and it was flooding all over the place. But the supermarket, being desperate for money, refused to close the booth down, so I showed up for my typical 5 to 11 p.m. shift in the pouring rain. 3 hours into my shift, the power goes out due to the storm, which by this point has gotten downright apocalyptic. It's pitch black out there, and the rain is coming down hard, so I decided to sit tight in the booth while I wait for a manager or something to either let me go or to fix the power. Of course, this means the phones are down, so I can't call in the store, and nobody in their right mind is buying gas, so I decided to start doing my booth chores like cleaning the counter, counting cigarettes, tidying the drawer, etc. Now, this next part will require a bit more background information, so bear with me. The booth itself is supposed to be locked at all times, but one of the new hires managed to break the key off inside the lock, making one of our managers break the lock so we all could get back inside. That lock still hadn't been replaced, but we were told to pretend the door was still locked. The door still had a deadbolt, but I found it annoying to fool with, so I mostly just left it unlocked. Whenever I'd go to open the door, I'd pretend to put the key in and make an audible ksh sound like a lock being opened. Anyway, back to me sitting in the unlocked booth in the pitch-black pouring rain. I'm in the middle of my chores when I hear something outside the booth, like a muffled sort of splashing sound. Again, there is zero visibility, so I press my ear against the door and I can clearly hear someone walking around the booth, in the rain, before stopping in front of the door. Before I can kick myself for not locking it, I hear that ksh sound, followed by the most dreadfully quiet couple of seconds. I'm just waiting to die at the hands of some deranged serial killer or crackhead, when suddenly, the footsteps start splashing back into the woods. I quietly soil myself as I race to lock the deadbolt and I wait out my shift. I would occasionally hear the footsteps outside, but it never tried to open the door. Finally, my manager drives over in a truck to close me out for the night. Since I'm still kind of new here, I didn't want to seem like I was delusional or crazy or that I was a crackhead, so I never mentioned it to him or anyone else at the store. A few months later, this kid I was training told me he'd heard footsteps real late one night during a storm, and thankfully, the lock had been replaced since then. I just tell him it was nothing, but not to open the door if he thinks there is something out there. Not because I didn't want to look delusional, but because I can't explain this phenomenon. Now fast forward a couple of months, and I'm still working at the booth. By this point, I'm the second oldest person working there, so sometimes I'd get calls from younger coworkers when they accidentally mess up. On this particular night I was off, but I still got a call from this high schooler who I'll call Rhea. I look at the time and it's 9:30, so I sigh and pick up the phone, and before I can even get in a "what happened," Rhea is in hysterics, saying something about her trainee being missing, and then lots of sobbing. Confused, if not a little agitated that she called me first, I try to get her to call the cops or something if he's been kidnapped, but she insists that she can't call the cops because they wouldn't believe her. So, my next line of thinking is to ask her why she hasn't told a manager, and she cries some more and says that they wouldn't understand. More agitated than confused, I agreed to go out there and calm her down. I get dressed, go out there, and park next to the booth. There were no customers around, and the girl was just standing in the booth, staring at the door. She spots me, opens the door, and starts sobbing, telling me to hurry inside. Eventually, I got her to stop crying long enough to tell me what happened. Apparently, she was training this new guy, Matt, who was an older guy about my age, and she said, the dude felt off, like a robot or something, and kept staring at her all dazed. Several times he would stop talking mid-sentence and ignored her attempts to address it. At this point, she's getting real uncomfortable and is about to call into the store about him when he starts sort of humming, she says. She described it as kind of like as if someone was attempting to imitate a purring cat, like they were breathing heavily and buzzing at the same time. So she reaches for the phone, and he reacts by grabbing her hand and just staring at her. She starts bawling at this point, begging him to stop, and he lets go of her hand, then opens the door and just sprints off into the woods out of sight. She said he came back a few minutes just before I got there and asked to be let back in, but she refused, so he just ran back into the woods. At this point, I'm either thinking he picked up on the meth phase that the neighborhood was slinging around or that she's being dramatic. Regardless, the story sounded pretty dangerous and we needed to call the cops or something at least. I tell her we're going to call the cops and then we're going to walk outside and wait for them, but she doesn't want to go outside. She says that she can almost feel him waiting out there. Tired, irritated, and not really buying the story, I just say screw it. She can stay in the booth and call the cops while I make sure the tree line is clear. I take this weak little flashlight that I stashed out there after the first story and go outside to start scanning the tree line. I barely begin shining the light around when, suddenly, the hair stands up on the back of my neck as I hear this humming noise. She described it rather well, too, because it sounded kind of like cicadas mixed with breathing. I look inside the booth and she's curled up in the chair, staring to my left. I didn't even look where she was staring, I just immediately booked it back to get inside. But I left the keys with her, and she's not getting up to let me in. I'm pounding on the door while screaming at her to let me in, and the humming stops abruptly as I hear something behind me and to the left. It's Matt. He's standing just on the edge of the trees. My panic intensifies, and at this point, Rhea finally lets me into the booth, and I immediately deadbolt the thing shut. All of a sudden, Matt is right outside asking to be let back in. He says he's sorry, and that he got a bit nervous back there, and he begins circling the booth while he just repeats the same couple of excuses, asking to come in. This continues for maybe 5 minutes before the cops arrive, and Matt just begins to run off into the woods again. I end up having to explain to both the cops and our manager what happened, leaving out the weird humming. As far as I know, Matt never showed up, so they fired him and Rhea quit eventually, and that was the end of it. I was never particularly close to Rhea since she was still in high school when I was in college, so we never got to talk about what happened. I have no idea what happened that night, though. Maybe Matt was just some doped-up meth junkie who was capable of making some really weird noises. I'll never know. I guess it could explain why he bolted out of there when the cops began to show up, but that day is still quite a mystery to my mind. I'm originally from Belarus, although I live in the United States now. I got my first job under the table in the early mid-90s. I was 12 to 13 and my job was being a helper in my father's barbershop, mostly sweeping up hair, cleaning the bathroom, taking out trash, that sort of thing. We lived, along with our shop, near the border with Poland. Lukashenko had just come to power and the Soviet Union had dissolved. These were very difficult times for everyone. Mass starvation and poverty swallowed the land. In fact, these problems still exist there today. But back to the story. I was at the barbershop with Papa, and we only really get the same few regulars since most people cut their own hair or have a family member do it. Maintaining a barbershop was really one of the only things possible during the Soviet Union. The day goes by and it's beginning to get dark. I'm told to clean up the shop, take out the trash, and then to come right home. After being lectured, Papa leaves me alone in the barbershop to go drink by myself somewhere. I finish my chores, I lock the door and finally begin walking home. Now, this is a pretty rural area, not exactly like the countryside, but everything is very spaced out. Hard to maintain a community around here, so everyone sort of sticks to their own privacy. As I'm walking home, I realize that I forgot to take out the garbage, and I turn around to go back. When I turn around, I suddenly noticed a LADA, a rather popular Russian vehicle, had been driving behind me with no lights on. Actually, I believe they were coasting, as there was no sounds of the engine humming, and we were also going slightly downhill. Since I'm going back my route, I'm now going uphill, and the car passes me by, and I feel somewhat at ease. Suddenly, the Lada gets to the bottom of the hill, cranks the engine on, and makes a U-turn. They pull up beside me, and I can see that it's a man and a woman inside. The man driving asks me if I want to lift to my location, but I tell them no thanks, that it's not far, and that, well, they are severely creeping me out. They get offended that I told them they are creeping me out and begin to yell at me, calling me all sorts of nasty things, telling me they hope I slip and crack my head open. Figuring they were possibly just drunk, I tell them to F off and cut through the grass and trees, and I get off the road. I take a shortcut through this little wooded area that eventually will link back to the street on the other side, but by that point, some time should pass. Yet when I get there, the Lada from before is now idling on the road. I won't lie. At this point, I'm getting extremely agitated. I come from a home with an alcoholic father and was sort of a Slav squat. I was quite used to confronting adults, and with my attitude, it also meant that I had been getting beaten by adults as well. So these random people acting all tough didn't scare me so much. I know it's edgy, but I don't know. You get used to it. You can read a person on whether or not they're actually going to attack a child or not, and you'd be surprised by how many actually do. Filled with anger, I walk up directly to the car and ask the man, "Hey, what, you following me? You like me or something? You want me, huh? You want a kid? Why don't you go F your sister or whatever that is in there with you? Why don't you leave me alone?" The man pauses for a second and puts his hand up to the window, holding a gun or something that looks like a gun. It was dark and I couldn't see very well, and he says, "You can either have a good night or your last. If you get in the car, we can drive around a bit, have some vodka, have some fun. But if you don't, I'll kill you right here." Ironically, while I've been in fistfights with adults before, I've never been confronted with a gun. I don't know what to do at this point, but I know that there's no way I'm getting in this freak's car, and I hesitate for a moment before I say, Okay, I'll get in," and act like I'm going along with the plan. I go to the passenger side, and the woman gets out to let me in. I believe she was going to say something like, "Good boy," but as she got out of the car, I kicked her in the leg as hard as I could and started running. She yelped and fell over, and by the time they knew what happened, I was back in the trees. It was a circular wooded area that was surrounded by roads, sort of like a large roundabout, but I could get to the center where they couldn't see me. They wouldn't know which side I would come out on, so I sit and wait in the middle for a while before deciding enough time had passed and I come out the side nearest the barber shop. I sprint from the woods up the road into the shop. I unlock the door, jump inside, lock the door, and stay there for the entire night. In the morning, my father showed up to the shop and beat me for never coming home. And I tried to explain what happened with the kidnapped attempt and even tried describing the car, but he got even angrier. He just accused me of lying, saying that I was using what I saw on the news to make up a lie. Yeah, by the way, this is unfortunately common. Not an everyday thing, but it got to the point that reported kidnappings were as common as car break-ins in America, if you want a comparison. Apparently, these two had gone around the whole village, asking any kids they saw if they wanted a lift, and there were reports of them making threats, etc. The exact profile of what happened to me. After my experience, I paid close attention to the news in hopes of these people getting caught, but instead, I only read headlines about children going missing, and how there was an abundance of missing kids from the past few months. It was assumed that the children had their organs harvested or were trafficked to other countries or were killed and eaten in response to the mass starvation. Unless you were like my family or were relatively wealthy by the standards of the day, it was very likely that you didn't eat much, if at all. I barely remember being 6. I barely remember first grade or what my favorite shirt was, but I do remember when I met the man who borrowed our sleeping bags. My dad is a very wonderful, kind man and always has been. So when one of his best friends asked if his brother could borrow some camping equipment for the weekend, my dad instantly helped. Charles came over and I, floating beside my dad, wondering in my 6-year-old brain what he was up to without me. He let Charles borrow a few sleeping bags along with some other items. I live in Washington State, and it tends to rain a lot here, so he said that he'd be camping out in his van. My dad saw him off, and that was that, for a few days. Now, Charles was a piece of work. A few nights later, he went to a party where bountiful amounts of meth was provided along with whatever else. 2 homes sat beside each other, so the adults left the sleeping kids in one house and continued the party at the other. Charles left the party and decided that he would go next door. He knocked on the window of Kayla, a 6-year-old girl who knew Charles well. He told her that he had a new puppy and wanted her to see. He led her to the van, and you can see where this was going. Charles brutally murdered Kayla, stuffed her in one of our sleeping bags, and headed to our house. He pulled up at around 10 p.m. or so, asking my dad for gas money. Now, my father doesn't get mad often, but this infuriated him. He yelled, "What are you doing here? My children are sleeping and my wife is here. You need to leave. I don't have any money for you." Charles said a few more things to my dad and took off in his van, high as a kite, and the whole time having Kayla inside his van, deceased. A few days later, my mom and dad saw our sleeping bags on the news as evidence in the murder, and my parents instantly called 911 and gave them all the information they could. My parents ended up testifying in court about it that night. Even though they were together at that point, this was something very important for them to attend regardless of their dislike for the other. I remember my mom crying, saying Kayla and I were the same age, and that it was devastating that she lost her life so young and in such a brutal manner. I met Charles that day when he came to our house. I remember him. I remember everything about this murder because my mom made sure I never misunderstood what people would do. You can find my dad and mom in the court hearing information in a local paper at the time for the testimony that they'd given. I always think about Kayla, how she would have looked if she would have had kids. I never met Kayla, but she's been a very important part of my life and others. You can't trust others all the time, especially not around your children. "10 years ago, I was in the Army, stationed at Fort Benning in Georgia. In Georgia, there can be a load of completely random thunderstorms in the summer. They really do just come out of nowhere. The sky can be blue and sunny with barely a single cloud in the sky, and then 20 minutes later, you would think you're in the worst storm of your life. When these storms approach, the base would issue lightning warnings. They would blow their air sirens, and all personnel on the base were supposed to get inside for safety. We were out in the field doing some pre-deployment tasks, and we're heading in to get cover. As we were in the middle of doing that, a soldier about 50 meters away all of a sudden got struck by lightning. It was hands down one of the most disturbing things I'd ever seen. To watch a man, a human being, just get slaughtered by something no one had control over within milliseconds. He had a family too, and he was a good dad and husband, which just made it even worse. After the fact, I wasn't aware the effects of getting struck by lightning could vary. Many people actually survive with some degrees of burns and scars. Not him. He was completely turned inside out and unrecognizable. Even though we knew who he was, obviously they still had to identify the body via dental records. That's just how torn apart he was. Speaking of spontaneity, people also need to be more concerned with lake trips and vacations. It's not as wonderful as commercials and advertisements make them out to be. People need to remember that anything can happen at any time, on any day, and sometimes for seemingly no reason at all. It's just fate, I guess. For example, I used to work at this park with a lake as a main attraction. One day it was really peaceful out in the lake. The park wasn't packed, which was surprising. And then boom, all of a sudden, a dude drowned after falling out of his paddle boat. The death itself was already horrible, but What made it even more morbid was that he was there with a school group for their last summer vacation, along with his family too. So I experienced not only a dead body, but also ended up seeing young children coming to grips with human death for the first time. One of the friends of the deceased tried to fight with the park rangers because he thought they didn't try hard enough. To be fair, they tried the best they could, and the friend had to be dragged away by police. Another girl had told the deceased to wear a life jacket, which he didn't, and ended up blaming herself for not pressing the issue hard enough. One of the guys who ran the boat's rental heroically dove into the lake to pull up a girl who was also without a life jacket that was in the boat with the deceased when they fell, and he no doubt saved her life. When the family of the deceased finally saw the confirmation of the body, they almost immediately began wailing and howling in remorse, forming a tight circle to provide some measure of support. A crowd had gathered to watch the police fish the poor guy out of the lake, then a fight broke out because someone was smoking and another took offense. There really isn't an end to the story. They took his body out of the lake and then everyone reacted in whatever ways their brain enforced. Anger, dread, and grief, when it was supposed to be simply some kid's classroom's last day of school before their big summer break. At the time of the story, I was a 20-year-old Croatian student looking for a summer job to get some cash before college starts. One day, a friend that lives on one of the islands in Croatia tells me about a captain of a tourist ship who was looking for crew members. I've always liked boats and felt at peace when I was out in the waters, so this seems like the opportunity for me. I end up learning that there's only 2 people working on the boat, the captain and some friend of his. Of course, the captain's buddy is good for nothing and only got the job because he's the captain's friend. The captain probably just wanted the company, as he is a very experienced sailor who ended up teaching me everything. I work 12 hours every day, mostly alone because the other guy is always drunk or hungover and doesn't even show up. The pay isn't much, and the job is even more difficult since I do 90% of the work. The captain has to steer the ship, so he obviously can't help me. However, I still love every minute of it. When I get free time, I talk with the tourists and try to score with the ladies. End of summer approaches, and it's my last week on the ship, so I give the captain my notice so he can find a replacement. He finds some chubby, inexperienced kid to replace me and asks me to teach him everything. I felt a little annoyed, but also definitely felt good to pass down my knowledge that I learned firsthand from the captain. At this point, I haven't seen the buddy on the ship for a week now. So the kid is basically useless, but he's got heart, which I can respect. I try to teach him to tie the ropes after leaving port, but the kid just can't seem to get the hang of it. One day we sail out on strong winds and the captain puts me on horde control so tourists don't get jumpy. Meaning my hands are full and the kid is on his own. Meaning the kid has to tie ropes and, well, he doesn't. We barely get off the coast when a tourist accidentally knocks the rope over while nobody's watching. The rope then gets tied up in the propeller, and the ship suddenly stops. And now, we're adrift in the middle of nowhere, and the wind is beginning to wreak havoc on us. The captain tells me to go under and cut the rope free. Now, I don't know how deep it was where we were, but the water was pitch black when looking from the ship. Nevertheless, it was that, or we drift for hours or sink due to wind. I take my shirt off and jump into the freezing water, and the cap throws me the mask and a knife. I swim to the propeller and start cutting at the ropes, when I begin to feel like there was this constant feeling that something is watching me. Not someone, something. I stop, come up for air as the rope was quite thick and that feeling fades away. I catch my breath and dive back down and look into the deep. All of a sudden, like a snap of your fingers, the feeling is back. Something is down there, and I begin to panic, and I start cutting as fast as I can, looking around to see if I can find anything. Finally, I look down while cutting, and something big floats beneath me. The water was dark, but I clearly saw a shadowy figure move under me. I'm still panicking and cutting, and I end up slicing my hand, but the rope finally snaps. Whatever it was, It felt like Cthulhu itself was about to snatch me and tear me apart. I rip the rope from the propeller and swim to the surface. I don't even use the stairs, I just climb onto the ship using the anchor, and the captain looks at me and says, "Hey, what happened? You're bleeding, you okay?" I don't answer, and the captain looks at my face and just goes silent. I guess I was in shock and had that 1,000-yard stare, and it almost seemed like he knew exactly why, like he'd seen something before. He takes me to the ship hold as the tourists are cheering me like I saved the country or something. Meanwhile, I can't even get my breath back because of the fear that I felt. The captain patches me up and gives me the rest of the day off, says he and the kid will take care of the horde and doesn't ask what happened. And the next day, I quit. The captain is sad, but says he understands. But fast forward to 2 years, I've never stepped foot back on a ship after that experience. I have this massive fear of the depths, and I can't even swim more than 100 meters from the shore before this deep anxiety kicks in. I even have nightmares about it, and of course, nobody believes me when I tell them. Maybe now I can finally understand the captain's buddy and why he was vanishing constantly. Maybe that's why he was drunk all the time. So yeah, I worked a dream summer job on a ship, had to fix my replacement's accident, saw an unexplainable figure in the deep void, and never went on a ship again, and went from loving the ocean and the deep blue to being completely petrified of simply swimming. I've got working a little bit, but I'll share some stories. I was born and raised in God's country, Lafayette, Louisiana, but my dad's side of the family is all Appalachian mountain folk. I mean, they are 100% American-bred country bumpkins, the kind you can barely understand when they talk to you. They're good people, though, and great storytellers, so I grew up listening, wide-eyed, to their crazy tales of mountain witches and other kinds of beings in the woods. For example, when I was really young, my dad used to cut our hair. He scooped it up and then would go out into the woods for a little while. I never questioned this until one day my youngest brother got his first haircut. As usual, Dad cut it, and when he was done, he'd scoop up the hair off the ground like he always did. This time, however, our grandfather was there in the room. He spoke up and said, "Make sure to bury it." And my dad nodded and went out into the woods. I was about 10 by this point, and I had never been told that Dad was burying our hair, so I asked about it, and Grandpa said that witches use your hair to cast spells on you. He said that you've got to go out where no one can see you and dig a hole and bury it. Otherwise, witches will use it to curse you. My grandpa is shocked that I've never heard that before, as if it's a completely normal thing for anyone to know. He then asked me, "Didn't your dad ever explain how to tell if a witch made a curse out of your hair?" I tell him, "No, sir." And he explains that witches can put spells on bits of human hair to make a person sick, or to make them do things. Occasionally, this will result in a hairball, he says. I'm thinking that he means like the kind of hairball that a cat hawks up, but he describes it as a big, tangled up wad of hair. It just appears like out of thin air, wherever you are. It sounds obviously fake, but he calls my older cousin over who was staying with us at the time. "Hey, tell him about the time he found a hairball." My cousin's eyes go wide. He begins to go on this rant, saying that during one morning he was at the breakfast table talking to his brother. They were sitting across from each other when a big wad of hair just materialized out of thin air. They watched it apparently manifest right in front of their eyes before it floated over towards my cousin. "Those witch balls can burn your skin," he told me. So he grabbed a pair of tongs and plucked it out of the air, careful not to touch it. Then he tossed it into a fire. I asked him if anything ever happened after that, but he said no. I asked if he'd ever been burned by one of those hairballs, and he said no, but that his friend had. Apparently, this friend was out on his farm one day when he heard a cow mooing in the woods. Thinking one of his cows escaped, he followed the noises until he came to a small clearing, but there was no cow there. All of a sudden, as his friend described it, a bunch of witch balls appeared out of thin air and encircled him. He knew what they were immediately and took off running, but he ran into a few on his way out, and the next day, His face and arms and neck were covered in these huge burns. "Look kind of like road rash," he said quietly. Afterwards, my grandfather told me to be careful about my hair, and from then onward I always made sure Dad buried my hair if he cut it. I know it's all imaginary folklore now, probably to keep hair from clogging drains or something, but good God if I still don't do it myself. Here's another one from Grandfather. There's apparently some strange phenomenon that happens before some people die. They just call it the knocking. Every time before someone died, they'd hear a tapping at the front door. The tapping always stopped as soon as someone went to check on it, but the next day, someone in that house would be dead. Sometimes only the person who was about to die would hear it, but usually multiple people would hear it, and apparently it happened to someone in my family, one of my dad's cousins. He was outside with a bunch of friends and family when they all heard someone pounding on the front door of the house. They looked over, but no one was there. They figured maybe one of the kids had gone inside and was playing around, so they got back to talking. The pounding started again, and my dad's cousin went over to tell the kids to stop messing around, but again, nobody was there. He closed the door and began walking towards everybody in the yard when the knocking came again, this time quieter. My dad's cousin looked back and nothing was there. My grandfather said everyone got spooked because they all knew that this meant that there was going to be a death in the family. And the next day, my dad's cousin was found in his bed, dead, with no apparent causes. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. I used to be in the Navy, stationed on the Aegis-class guided missile cruiser. One day at sea, I'm taking a break on the flight deck, which was just behind the rear Aegis radar array, and I noticed all these dead birds all over the flight deck. It didn't take me too long to realize that these birds had flown in front of the radar and were more than likely microwaved to death. Thus, this gave me an idea. I figured if the heat works on birds, it should work on popcorn. A microwave's a microwave, right? So the next time we pulled into port, I went and got some microwave popcorn. Unfortunately, my shopping trip coincided with, at the time, Super Bowl Sunday, so the microwave popcorn was gone, along with just about every other salty snack in the store. All they had left was Jiffy Pop. I didn't even know they still made Jiffy Pop. Anyway, science waits for no man, so I returned to the ship and stashed the popcorn in my shop. During our next outing, I began my conjuration. I tied some string to the handle of the Jiffy Pop pan and snuck out onto the weather deck. Just forward of my shop was a ladder that led to the deck that was overlooking the radar array. Normally it is closed off during radar operations for safety reasons, so I climbed up there and lowered the Jiffy Pop down in front of the array. Boom. The Jiffy Pop explodes immediately, showering the flight deck with burned popcorn. I pull the burst pan up, wind up my string, and chuck the entire apparatus over the side before running back into my shop. No sooner do I walk in the door than the phone rings. It's CICS, or the Control Center, also referred to as the War Room. The officer in charge wants me to go out on the weather deck and look behind us and tell him if anything's there. I do. There isn't, obviously, and I tell him so. He hangs up, swearing. Later that night, I heard about a story from a friend of mine who was in CICS at the time, acting as a radio man. It turns out that the Jiffy Pop pan had actually reflected the radar waves, something I didn't even think about since the pan was made out of aluminum and metal. For those who aren't familiar with radar operation, a radar array sweeps back and forth, radiating waves the whole time. The waves are then reflected back to the array by anything they hit, such as planes, other ships, etc. When I lowered the pan down, the reflection falsely told the radar how big the object was and how far away it was. The problem, however, comes with the wavelengths involved. At too close of a distance, an object can show up on the radar as being at a different distance than it really is, or a different size. My Jiffy Pop pan appeared on the radar as a 3-mile wide contact, 100 yards off the stern, and was only on screen for a couple of seconds before disappearing. The officer in charge was freaking out about it, and had called up the Air Force to report a miscellaneous object. So, in the end, my curiosity about the microwave properties of an Aegis radar caused a U.S. Navy warship to file a false UFO report. Of course, I kept my head down the rest of the time on board, and I didn't tell anyone I was involved until long after I got out. Several years ago, my dad broke into an abandoned house in our neighborhood on a somewhat drunken impulse. While there, he claimed to have heard a disembodied voice speaking in Japanese, only to find out later that the last occupant of the house was indeed Japanese. We lived in a town with a pretty much non-existent Asian community, and the house had laid empty for years since the occupant's death in the house. If he did not hear a ghost in that house, then I don't know what it could have been. He fled the house that night with a single trophy of his escapade, an old vintage metal pitcher. For years after this, the pitcher rested on a shelf in our house with no incident. However, the incident started after my parents divorced. My siblings and I were all adults at this point, out of the house and on our own. The divorce was messy and full of emotional distress, and my mother was left alone in the house. That was when the incidents began. For weeks, my mother would hear strange noises and banging sounds emanating from the room where the pitcher was kept. They only stopped when my brother took the pitcher and kept it in his apartment, which he shared with a girlfriend. Seemingly like before, nothing happened until my brother and his girlfriend hit what he described as a rough patch. They experienced the same strange sounds and banging noises in this time of anger and sadness, which began to suggest a correlation. Emotional distress triggers or fuels the strange occurrences. I myself took the pitcher next. I shared a house with several other people, and though there was plenty of emotional distress, I can't say for certain that I experienced anything. Of course, there were enough odd noises and banging sounds from more natural sources that I'm not sure I would have noticed if there was anything to experience. Everything would have just blended together for me. I moved out of the house to live with my current girlfriend, leaving the pitcher behind and more or less forgetting about it until a few days ago. Recently, there has been a new development. I recently hired one of my former roommates who was ignorant of the pitcher's history and did in fact barely know it existed. We were talking about weird memories and unsettling things, and he told me of something he couldn't explain. With working 2 jobs, my former roommate, who we'll call Charlie, keeps odd hours and sleeps whenever he catches a chance. Recently, Charlie was awakened by sounds from the living room. It seemed to sound like another roommate, who we'll call Ashley, talking to someone. He said he distinctly heard 2 voices. Charlie told me he was confused because it was very late and he was unaware of any visitors. He stepped out into the hall just in time to see Ashley step into her bedroom, followed by a tall figure dressed in black. Charlie thought it was a friend of theirs named David and asked Ashley about it the next day. Confused, she told him David didn't visit last night. In fact, no one did, and that she went to her bedroom alone. Charlie told her that he could hear them talking, before Ashley staggered out saying that she could actually hear Charlie talking to someone at roughly the same exact time. She too heard 2 distinct voices, only they seemed to be coming from his bedroom. So as far as I know, this is the first time anyone has seen any sort of apparition relating to the pitcher. But Ashley's bedroom is right next to the laundry room, which is where I left the pitcher. I told him to bring the pitcher up to work on his next scheduled day. If he does, I'll follow up with another thread, maybe get a Ouija board and hold a seance or something. I'm open to suggestions. No one has yet tried to actually evoke any sort of haunting from this thing, but I intend to try. Idaho's the scariest place that you have never given a second thought about. First off, there are about 1.5 million people in a landmass that's about half the square mileage of California. That's not a lot of people. About 90% of the state is wilderness. I mean, you could easily hide a body here, and it's doubtful anyone would come across it anytime soon, if you went deep enough. Few things off the top of my head, there are at least 2 military caches in the state. According to my aunt, who works for the Forest Service, she had to visit one while enlisted and has since been back for some reason while being in the Forest Service. She says that since World War II, the United States has hidden caches of arms in the state to be used in a guerrilla warfare campaign if we were ever invaded. Speaking of which, the Idaho National Laboratory is federally funded and where the first nuclear power was ever generated to power a city. They keep that place under lock and key, and there are rumored UFO sightings all the time. The hometown was about 50 miles away from that place, and a wave of silent, hovering triangles were reported a few years back. Most of the time, people would describe them heading from the west in the same direction as the laboratory site. My own UFO sighting, which got me interested in the paranormal, was part of this flap. And of course, it was heading from the west, passed over silently and low, and went east towards Wyoming. Further on the INL, someone close to me who was formerly in the Air Force was driving home through the desert after a trip to the western half of the state. For reference, State Highway 33 runs parallel with the southern border of the INL site for many miles. It's eerie out there, no towns for 30 miles and nothing but sagebrush. So he comes across this scene that was totally lit up by floodlights when he was right on the border of the INL site. He then blinked and somehow, half an hour of time had suddenly passed. He only talked to me about this once. Continuing from that UFO incident, I became quite the explorer of the paranormal through my late teens. Naturally, I segued into ghost hunting eventually. I spent a lot of time hunting for ghosts, and I can tell you that some places are genuinely haunted, and yes, some are complete hoaxes. There are many places that are haunted that you would never expect around Idaho, but there is one place I'll never go alone, and I doubt I would go, period. Little Butte Cemetery is a place not to be taken lightly. Typically, cemeteries are places that are pretty peaceful, and most stories of hauntings there are fabrications. This cemetery, though, an exception can be made. It's filled with spirits, mostly mundane, probably people that have passed that are lost. I know that there are child spirits there, or at least something that is very good at mimicking a child. But there is one spirit there that is particularly frightening. He appears as a well-built, vaguely hooded, almost 7-foot shadow figure. Unfortunately, my fellow ghost hunter friends and I attracted this thing to us for a few months. I think it could be a guardian spirit, but most likely I think it's a malevolent spirit that feeds on fear. It followed us for a while. We'd see it standing on street corners and buildings for months. After a while, I think we stopped giving it what it wanted and haven't seen it for about 8 years now, thankfully. Many people have gone to this place to investigate since then, and I won't lie, I like to feel that I turned it into an urban legend of sorts. That thing has become something of a legend. There's many other hauntings throughout the state, not all I've checked out. Boise's Egyptian Theater is extremely haunted, as is the state penitentiary. Near Preston, there was an Indian massacre near the turn of the century, and now on the site you can hear crying and sometimes see apparitions. I could go on, but suffice to say that nearly every town has that place or story, sometimes multiple ones. I'm sure that you have all figured out that I'm from the eastern half of the state. For whatever reason, East Idaho has had tons of reports of satanic or pagan activity, at least since the late 80s. Now I know what you're thinking. That's just a byproduct of the satanic panic, a hokey urban legend because everyone saw Satan everywhere at that time in a place known for its Mormon extremism. But the stories keep popping up, and have been for 30 years, at least until the late 2000s. One example comes from a friend from school. He lived way out in the boonies, about 10 miles out of town. He came across a group of people on his land, all wearing robes and chanting. They were in the process of killing all his hens, nailing them to trees. He grabbed his gun and took a shot at them, and they took off. This guy was a straight shooter, a bit of a redneck with not much of an imagination, so I do lean towards believing this story. Another anecdote comes from his friend's uncle. We got on this topic one night, and he got very somber and proceeded to tell us about his experience. Similar to my friend, the uncle came across a group in the late 80s performing some sort of ritual on his property. north of Idaho Falls at the time. He took a running start with a rebel yell to tackle at least one of them, and they took off at what he described an inhuman speed. One that he was chasing jumped over a chain-link fence in one bound. Either Satan has an Olympian for a homeboy or something more sinister was going on. You could tell this genuinely scared him, and I knew him very well. He is not a person to take lightly. Stories like this are all over eastern Idaho, of occult groups making their presence known in the boonies. It seems a lot of the old-timers in town have anecdotes like these ones, so either it's actually happening, or a lot of people are lying. I've got a weird story. It's nothing super wild, but it weirded me and my girl out for long enough that we still talk about it. My morning routine is always the same. Wake up, shower off, drink coffee, and head out. So that morning, I'm taking a shower, sitting in the tub feeling like even a full pot of coffee won't wake me up this morning when, all of a sudden, I get this rush of immense dread. I tried to rationalize it, but there was nothing detrimental happening with my work that had caused me to feel this intense. And I realized that I feel like someone is on the other side of the curtain. I get a little annoyed, but try to shrug off the confused panic that was settling in for seemingly no good reason. Yet I couldn't shake off this dread. It seriously felt like someone was going to poke their head in and stare at me, and I could not shake this feeling. Somehow, I feel like I already knew what they look like, as my rational side begins to wonder if there was something leaking into the water pipes causing me to feel this way. Suddenly, the feeling begins to become unbearable, and I open the curtain against my best interest. The feeling simply disappears, and I'm left feeling just severely weirded out. I quickly finish washing off and proceed throughout my day. Now fast forward a couple of weeks. At this point, this feeling happened to me a couple of times, maybe 5 times in total. One afternoon, my wife says, "I have a weird question. Do you ever get a weird feeling in the shower like you're being watched?" It was so specific that I couldn't help but begin to feel like I was going to wet myself. Keep in mind, I've never told anyone about this experience before, so I tell my story about what I've experienced and nervously laugh off how weird it was that she brought it up. "It almost feels like you know what he looks like, right?" she says as we hash out more details. My brain kind of haywires for a second, and I instantly take a step back. This isn't just a coincidence anymore. She's describing my exact dread moments word for word. "Yeah, like a man with a crazed smile, and eyes too wide, and if you wait too long, he'll open the curtain," I managed to say back. We similarly freak out together and realize that something's weird, if not straight up wrong, with the bathroom. And this went on for a while, but with less frequency, until one day, it just stopped. We still talk about this to this day because it was so obscure. No clue what it was about, and we're both not super into ghosts or whatever, but we couldn't deny that weird experience though. Another quick one-time experience we had was during a late night after some laughs on YouTube and wine. Feeling the buzz of the wine, we decide to start watching horror movies and mysteries and enjoy the good spooky mood in the air. Soon, we started chatting about what makes a good horror story, as we were bored of the LARPs and the videos. Suddenly, we both get this weird vibe about the room. I joke about how we're manifesting spookiness into reality, but she shushes me and asks me if something is outside. We lived on the top story of our complex at the time, and the window overlooked a bunch of trees. It was nothing fancy and not as fun or nature-esque as it sounds. The trees are slightly diseased from growing in a water runoff, and they squeak and squeal in the wind. I take a look, and there's nothing outside except the sickly trees. She just kind of sits there, blank expression on her face. "There's something outside," she says. I look again, and just like before, there's nothing of note there. "I think you might be drunk, babe. Here, let's just listen to music and change the mood," I say with false confidence. I'm not going to lose my shot at a good night over some spookiness. "Just close the blinds, please," she mutters. Fine. If it means I can move the night on, I'll close the blinds, I think to myself. I stand up to close the blinds, and they suddenly fall right out of the window just as I go to reach for that little rope. We exchange confused and freaked out looks, and she jumps away from the window. That's an odd coincidence, I say, beginning to drunkenly put the blinds back up, but now she's too freaked out to let it slide. The night does eventually go on, with me telling her that I must have just drunkenly pulled too hard, but I know I didn't. I barely even had my finger around the string before the whole blinds collapsed. And we spent the night trying to ease ourselves, but both kept looking out the window, occasionally. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/Let'sReadOfficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, watch out for witch balls. They burn.
G'day mates, it's Buster here, and I would like to give Ana Luisa a big shout out for sponsoring this episode. So, are you looking for the perfect gift for yourself or for somebody special? Then Ana Luisa has you covered. Ana Luisa provides beautiful, sustainable jewelry that not only looks terrific, but also comes with a great price tag. And for my listeners, I managed to pick up an even better deal with a discount of 10% off of all products. Their jewelry starts at the affordable price of just $39 with no luxury markup, and I can attest to the quality of their product. I decided to get the missus a little something for our anniversary, the Anna Silver necklace from the fine jewelry section, and man, was it the perfect gift. The glossy texture and the delicate design are exactly what I was looking for, and the composition of the piece is perfect because it doesn't catch on clothes or hair, which is great for my wife because she now wears it every time she goes out for business meetings or to catch up with friends. The company also offsets 100% of their carbon emissions, starting with the sourcing of their raw materials all the way to the disposal of their pieces. Their shipping is excellent and comes with custom taxes included for international customers, and with a 10% discount to boot, you can't go wrong. You can also check them out by following their Instagram or by subscribing to their newsletters, in which they always offer perks for engaging customers. So, go to analuisa.com/scared, that's ANALUISA.com/scared, treat yourself and your loved ones with a unique gift, and use my code SCARED to get 10% off. I absolutely recommend them. They're a great brand making beautiful sustainable jewelry. Again, that's analuisa.com/scared. You can also find a link in the description within tonight's episode. In 2003, I dropped out when hitchhiking west with a friend, ran out of money after being homeless in Vancouver for a bit and burning every bridge possible, but we somehow managed to make it to Nanaimo. Because I was a terrible person at the time, I managed to get thrown out of the last place that we had to stay, a house that was in a small community, a 3-hour walk outside of the city past Nickel Street. The house backed onto Weyerhaeuser logging land and was owned by a distant relative of my travelling partner. We had been working as roadies or groupies for this girl power punk band from Nanaimo called We've Been Had, and I had snuck one of them into the house and just, well, made a mess of everything. So my friend was angry at me. The band was also angry at me, and I'm certain 2 of them specifically wanted me dead. So to put a long story short, I'm homeless, broke, 3 hours outside of the city, and I turned towards the forest and walked into it. I had 2 bags of tomatoes, a bag of Wonder Bread, and some mayo. I also had a tent, a crank-powered lantern, a hitchhiker's backpack with an aluminium frame, and a bunch of weed. During the day, I would just wander around the forest. There was a massive open area about an hour's hike away from my camp where you could sit on a cliff face and see for miles around down into the forested valleys. It was a bit like nature's TV, I guess you could call it. I would go there in the morning, usually freezing my butt off, and the sun would warm the cliff face as it got closer to noon, and I would warm up with it and just sit, get stoned, and watch the crags for wildlife. It was a bizarre and foreign feeling to me, being thousands of kilometers away from anyone who cared about me back home. Canada really is immense. And then this new layer of isolation from everyone on the island after I messed everything up yet again. I felt almost monastic. Like, if I were to perish in these woods, it would be a just punishment or some sort of atonement, I guess. Anyway, I ate the food that I had sparingly and did whatever drugs that I had with me. Eventually, my friend forgave me enough to hike to my camp and visit, bringing stuff that he had stolen or busked for. Previously, we'd been working for a bit for this shady couple who made jewelry, and they were somehow connected to the local Hells Angels chapter. The whole community in the outskirts of this place was at the time, apparently. We would work buffing wheels all day, get a ton of metal flakes flung at us, no protection or anything. I remember being offered a job living in a grow house. It came with a Honda Civic, an Xbox apparently, and free cable. We turned it down though, and after that I started to feel a sense of hostility from the locals, which was another great addition to my now paranoia that I was living deep in the woods with. I would see a few animals every day while just sitting on the bluffs. I was too high and too far away to be noticed anyway. I saw bears and cougars, which made me nervous, I must admit. I had a knife, but it was small, so I made spears out of sturdy branches and spent a lot of sleepless nights clutching them in my tent like an idiot. It had been what felt like a month, I guess, or more maybe, when it first happened. So as I was about to head back to my camp with the last hour of sunlight, I saw a man standing on a rocky outcropping far across the crags. I could tell that he was heavily bared and shirtless, and that he had a bit of a red mark on him near the left hand, I think. Either blood or a swath of fabric or something, but not much else from the distance that I was at. But one thing that I did notice was that he had a log in his left hand. Not a walking stick or a staff, like a full-sized log. I watched him standing there, almost frozen, until his head moved ever so slightly, like he was looking towards me. And at that, I just booked it back to camp, sort of terrified. That night, I really didn't sleep much, and when I got the courage to hike back a few days later, I was relieved that there didn't seem to be any sign of him. That is, until 1 hour before sunset, when he showed up again. Same spot, same shirtless bearded guy dragging a full log in his left hand on a stone bluff 1,000 meters away. And something about the way that he moved, or didn't maybe, even from the distance that I was at, was deeply unsettling, and I wasn't about to get the hills have eyed, so I walked back. I decided that I would leave the next morning, head back home, somehow. But what followed was two of the most surreal and terrifying nights of my entire life. You see, I returned back to camp late, and it was getting cloudy, so there was almost no light. I didn't have a flashlight, but I had a Coleman crank lantern that I would leave at camp, again like an idiot. This time I barely made it back before it was pitch black. I could see my camp very well, but something about it just felt off. That's when I noticed that the tent zipper was open, which could have easily been my fault, as I had done that before, but this time it was unzipped so much I had to fish around in the tent flaps to dig the zipper out. And when I finally got it free, I heard a scraping sound. Something definitely not natural, and it was coming from the direction of the animal trail. I leapt into my tent, freaking out. I grabbed the crank lantern and I started reefing on it as I can still hear this deep, bassy scraping sound. I'm turning this crank and the lantern won't light up. I can still hear the scraping, but it also started to rain, and the raindrops on the tent sounded so loud for some reason that I'm getting sort of disorientated and more freaked out. I can't see anything, and now I also can't hear anything. The lantern too, which had worked every night since I'd been in this place, just all of a sudden refused to work. It was pitch black and raining. My tent at that time was already full of holes from nights spent using it like a sleeping bag on the cement highway shoulders. If you've ever hitched, then you'll understand this. And in the alleyways of Granville too, so it was also soaked on the inside. I remember just feeling so defeated and desperate in that moment that I just sort of sobbed and fell back into my gear with the flaps still slightly askew. It could have been exhaustion, drugs, or accumulated trauma, I don't know, but that night, I swear to you that I heard voices in the forest. Voices and the constant sound of that deep scraping. The voices, if they were speaking a language, I had no idea what it was, but I felt an accusatory and angry energy, as if the voices belonged to maybe demonic? I know, that sounds crazy, like something people summoned up that I had messed with. Something in my head convinced me that this was the case, and I began to spiral alone in the dark and the rain. I didn't sleep that night, obviously. I wanted to make it to the morning light so that I could make my way out of this place and back to the outskirts. But when morning came, it was raining so hard that I just couldn't leave. And by then I was so tired that I thought that I would rest for a couple of hours and see if the rain would pass. But when I woke up, it was almost dark again. And it was at this time that I really began to panic. I couldn't tell what hour of the day it was because of the clouds and stuff, and I wasn't sure if I wanted to risk hiking back through the muddy animal trail to the outskirts anyway. But I packed up my gear and decided that I would leave the tent as it was basically ruined anyway. I started walking back, but it got dark a lot faster than I thought it would. It was also really difficult because of the rain, and all I had to wear were these terrible black sandals that were super heavy with mud now. And I must have got about 30 minutes from my camp when I heard the scraping sound again, coming from what I perceived to be further up the path. It was at this that I just completely lost it, freaked out, and began to run back towards my camp. It was dark again by the time that I got back, and I could hear the voices again. I zipped up the tent and spent the next few hours shivering in the puddle of water that had accumulated on the bottom of the tent. I was convinced that these voices and sounds were being manifested by my stress, but somehow, while I could convince my mind, I just couldn't convince my body that this was the case. I felt paralyzed, and I honestly felt like I was about to die. I must have fallen in and out of sleep though, because when I woke up again, it was pitch black outside, but the rain had stopped. And there was just a real eerie sense of a lack of sound. My chest felt clenched, like I was having a heart attack, but somehow I managed to unzip the tent front and look out. The Coleman lantern miraculously had started working, so I cranked it a bit more and I looked around. And man, it was so quiet. I've never been in such a quiet forest before, in fact. I remember it being so insanely quiet that I started questioning it, in fact. And there was a mist from all the rain as well, and it was just super, super eerie. But it was at this point that I noticed, sitting in front of my tent, was a long, thick log. One end of it was in a pool of water, and I could have sworn that it had stained the ground red with something. I ran, leaving a bunch of stuff behind, for hours, all the way to the highway in the early morning. I really don't remember who found me, but I ended up in the cop shop eventually, and at that point, honestly, it was like walking into heaven. 2 days later, I heard about a girl that I knew who was going east, and she offered me a ride. She was running from something too, probably a dude, but I don't know. We did Nanaimo to the prairies in like 24 hours non-stop, including the ferry ride as well, because at that point, I just wanted to get out of there as fast as I could. When I was 14, I was asked to babysit my 3 younger cousins, aged 8, 4, and 1, in an extremely rural, mountainous part of Pennsylvania. My aunt and uncle, they had a wedding to go over an hour away and wouldn't be back until very late. Their house was situated on a steep mountainside. Their back deck had like a 15-foot drop onto a rocky hill below, leading down to a river. Their closest neighbours were about half a mile away, I would guess. The closest main road was like a mile away, and at night there were no lights to be seen anywhere around them. Basically what I'm trying to say is that it was in the middle of nowhere, and you wouldn't have even known that it was there if you weren't, like, going to it, that is. You don't just accidentally end up here, that's for sure. Now, my aunt and uncle left us with some pizza and their cell phone number next to their landline. This was the early 2000s, and I didn't have a cell phone, but even if I did, I wouldn't get reception there anyway, and headed out. The baby was already asleep. The 4-year-old wasn't feeling well and was quietly watching TV in the living room as he dozed off, and the 8-year-old was playing Guitar Hero with me on the loft. The loft overlooked the living room to the left, where I could keep an eye on the 4-year-old, and there was a huge window that overlooked the driveway to the right. Now, this description of the driveway is an important detail to this story. The road that led to their house ran straight into their forked driveway. It was a dead-end road. The house was far off as you could go, pretty much. Go to the left driveway. There's a large open carport, and that's where my aunt and uncle, and anyone who ever visited, parked. The right driveway led down a very short but very steep hill to a large leveled-out area, and ended up against the garage door that opened to the basement of the house. It was never used as a garage, but served as my uncle's man cave and where he spent most of his time. Right beside the garage door, a normal door with a window so that you could see right in was there, but this driveway was exclusively used by the kids as a play area because it was the only flat yard-like area on the property, and being on a mountainside, there isn't much room to safely play otherwise. No cars ever drove down there, ever. There are too many toys and bikes in the way anyway, and friends and family actually knew this. So, it was about 10 p.m, pitch black outside, no moon to illuminate the area either. My cousin and I were still playing Guitar Hero when headlights caught the corner of my eye. And it wasn't my aunt's minivan headlights. They were huge truck headlights with those roof lights that you often see on Jeeps or other off-road trucks. But not only that, the truck was going down the right driveway, the kids' play area. This was definitely not my aunt and uncle. This was, in fact, not anyone that they knew. Panic and dread began to fill my body at this. I was a teenage girl, alone in an isolated house on a mountain at night, with 3 children in my care. In a terrified voice, I asked my cousin, "Who is that? Jake, do you know whose truck that is?" And then he looked panicked. No, I've never seen that truck before," he replied. I quickly ushered him downstairs, still unsure what to do, but the 2 little ones were sleeping down there and I wanted to make sure that they were safe. I checked on the baby, and then grabbed the phone to call 911, and then I started to hear the metal garage door being shaken violently. Now, as I said before, no one ever opened that garage door, so more panic began to fill me. I hear them try to open the door beside it, the metal doorknob jiggling. No one was actually knocking. It's not like they were checking to see if my uncle was down there. Plus, the lights were out. It was dark down there. They knew that nobody was down there. They were definitely breaking in. The door leading to the basement steps were right next to the phone, so I could clearly hear all of this going on as well. I quickly turned the little lock on the doorknob just in case they did make it into the basement. My heart was practically jumping out of my chest. I'm talking to the 911 dispatcher at this moment as my 8-year-old cousin clings to my arm. The operator is calm and trying to calm me, but I knew that it was going to be at least 30 minutes until a police officer could get up there, assuming they didn't totally get lost in this mountainside in the pitch dark. But I just kept thinking, we're dead. This is how I'm about to die. The operator asked for the number of my aunt and uncle left me so that she could have another dispatcher call them to let them know the situation. I turned around to grab the paper with the number on it, and to my absolute horror, I see a man peering in the large sliding glass door. A huge, burly, what had to be at least 6'4" man with a long scraggly red hair and red bushy beard. And what made it even worse was that he was grinning at me. Grinning in a way that still scares me to this day. Meanwhile, I had to have looked like a terrified deer in the headlights. I was shaking so hard that I could barely hold the phone now. There was a second man behind him that I couldn't see as well. I have no idea what he looked like, but he was equally as tall, but a bit more lanky than the larger man at the sliding glass door. I screamed, "They're here," and before the 911 operator could say anything, my 8-year-old cousin goes, "Mr. Jim?" His voice was very confused. It wasn't like my cousin was happy or even relieved to see him. I asked, "You know who that is?" But before my cousin could answer, I turned my attention to the man in the door, and I scream, "I'm on the phone with the police." I'm grateful that he didn't try that door because I don't think it was actually locked at the time. But the man stared at me hard for a moment, eyebrows furrowed, like deciding what he wanted to do next. But then he just backed away into the darkness. What seemed like an eternity later, I saw the truck lights back out of the driveway and then back down the road until they disappeared. I was still scared beyond belief, and so was my cousin. He had only met that guy a few times, an acquaintance of his dad apparently. It wasn't like it was a close family friend or anything, and obviously because, again, he went down the wrong driveway, and visitors never go that way, he didn't know the family very well. The 911 operator asked for a description of the man, then told me that they'd gotten in touch with my aunt and uncle and that they were on their way home. She stayed on the phone with me until a police officer showed up a bit later to make sure the men were gone, and they stayed with us until my aunt and uncle got home so that they could ask them some questions. Now, my uncle was absolutely furious. Not at me for calling them home early, but at this Mr. Jim guy. He muttered something like, "I'm going to mess this guy up." My aunt was mad at my uncle, who told him to tell Jim to never come back again. I didn't know at the time, but my uncle actually had a drug problem. I don't know what Mr. Jim or his accomplices were doing, or what would have been done if I wasn't on the phone with the police that night, but the grin, it definitely wasn't a friendly one. It was sinister. And again, he also had to have known my uncle was not there because the basement was dark. He would have seen through the windowed basement door. He had also tried lifting the garage door, something not even my uncle did. In other words, he intended to break into that basement. That much is clear to me. But apart from that, there's no other explanation. I never did babysit for them again, and I don't think I ever went back up there because not long after that, my aunt divorced my uncle and moved out. This story takes place back in April of 2018. I live on Long Island and was in freshman year of high school. I was going through a tough time. Earlier in the week, my girlfriend broke up with me because of rumors that she heard about me, which I won't share here, but there was a lot of drama going around in my life at the time. Depression, broken hearts, typical high school stuff. My mum knew that I was down in the dumps, so one night she took me to get a new phone in the nearby mall. I had an iPhone 5 at the time, going on to an iPhone 8, so I needed a new one. We were gone for about an hour, I would guess. We returned home with my dog greeting us. And let me tell you something about my dog. He's a short, stocky golden retriever who's never violent or vicious in any way. This is important for later as well. My dad was still at work, so it was my duty to take out the trash. I went through the front door, with my dog resting on the porch, and went to the side of my house to throw out the trash. When I was throwing out the bag, I looked over to my neighbor's house, where I saw a guy dressed in all black, around 6 foot, walking out of their side door. Being a paranoid 14-year-old, I had a lot of red flags going off. Also, my neighbors and my neighborhood, I live in a safe neighborhood, but not 15 minutes away from walking distance. We live by a town that has high crime rates, ranging from muggings, drug dealings, and even murders from time to time. My neighbors have an older stepson who drag races a lot in the part of the town, so for some stupid reason, I wasn't in flight or fight mode yet because I was assuming that this could be one of his friends. Stupid of me, I know. Until there was another man, and then another one. There were 6 of these guys, all dressed in black, coming out of the house and from the backyard. It was then that I knew what was going on, so I tried walking away, acting like I saw nothing. When I was on my driveway, I saw 2 of the guys slowly walking towards me, and my blood instantly went cold. They were getting closer and closer before my dog came bolting off the porch, chasing 6 men down the street, and my dog came back. I was still standing on my driveway trying to process what I just saw. I went back inside with my mum asking what just happened. I told her what I saw with the 6 men coming out of the neighbor's house and heading towards me. And at that, she called the police and they came over to ask me questions. I described the 6 men as best as I could. The police told us that we weren't the first to experience this, as there were apparently 7 burglaries all over the town at the time, and I probably just witnessed them attempting to break in. I told the officers about 2 of the 6 guys walking toward me after I saw them, and they told me that since I saw them, they were trying to, I guess, stop witnesses. And that was basically a friendly way of them saying that the burglars were probably going to kill me since I saw what they were doing. As typical as this could get, the best they could do was a police report. I was always afraid of break-ins, but I never thought that I would ever experience one. To this day, I'm still surprised how my harmless golden retriever probably saved my life that night. And it showed me that no matter where you are in this world, this stuff can happen. 4 years have gone by, my family now owns a gun, and I'm currently training in kickboxing for self-defense. I don't know if I'll ever have to use it, but I guess it's better to be safe than sorry. My hometown is pretty small. So small, in fact, that I ran into this guy on 3 separate occasions. I remember being 8 or maybe 9 when this happened. So my younger brother, R, and I, we had stayed behind in the previous aisle playing with the small toy section. My mum had immediately called for us to follow her. R and I ran back to the shelf, threw our toys down, and ran as fast as we could down the aisle. But we rounded the corner. He rounded it tighter than I did. I was able to keep running on. I, however, ended up running into this tall, big, burly man. He just stared down at me, and even at that age, I remember thinking that he looked like he wasn't completely there. He didn't talk to me, and the look on his face was just weird. In any case, I apologized, and I ran back to my mum. For the rest of the time at the market, I remember constantly seeing him around, too. He'd be at either end of the aisle, or he would sort of cross the market, always looking my way. And his stare just made my skin crawl. When we exited the market, he was standing at the door just staring at me. I've had so many nightmares of this market, too. I can still remember the cold, grey concrete flooring and the exact layout. It terrifies me just thinking about it. I had begged my mum for us to never go there, and I remember either always staying home if she went there, or she would avoid that market if I was with her. But I saw him twice after this. This time, I was 12. So my mum and I had went to a fast food restaurant that was in the shape of an L, except sort of flipped. The shorter part of the restaurant was the cashier part, and the longer was the seating. There were two entrances, one at the end of the sort of straight section and one right in the corner where the flat section meets the straight section. I hope that makes sense. But we had parked and entered at the top of the L. We sat down right near the door, and she said that she would go order the food. As she's walking away, I see the door at the other end swing open, and in walks the same man from the market. And he looked exactly the same as I remembered in my nightmares. He was headed to the cashier when he turned his head and looked down the aisle. He looked at me and immediately changed course. Now, he was headed straight to me. He took a seat 2 tables ahead of me. He sat so that we were directly facing each other. I grabbed my mum and I told her that I didn't want her to go. I told her that that was the man that I hated so much, the one who had terrified me when I was a little kid. Well, we sat there for a few minutes while she calmed me down and told me that we would just quickly get up and head straight for the car. I remember I looked at her and then I saw his head poke to the side of her, which means that he wanted me to see him. He had that same look on his face too. His eyes were wide open and he looked sort of slack-jawed. After that, we quickly got up and we left that place. The last time that I saw him, I'm not sure what age I was, to be honest. Maybe around 12 or so, maybe a little bit older. But we had emerged into the freeway as I looked to my left and I see the man is driving. He looked over at me, immediately smiling when he saw my face. I told my mum that he was driving next to us, and she quickly got off the next turn, drove all around the town so that he wouldn't be able to keep up with us. At the time, I wasn't sure if he was following us, but asking my mum years later, she confirmed that he followed us all around the town for quite some time. I'm glad that I don't really remember much of that, but I think it was because my mum had told me to keep my head down. But I can still see him clear as day. I remember running into him. I remember the fear and the fright that he gave me. I think what scared me the most, though, about him was that he just looked really off. Like there was no line that he wouldn't cross to come and take me. He had no issue staring right into my eyes, in front of other people, letting me know that he wanted me. This happened way back in October of 2006. At that time, I was just a 19-year-old kid, always on the lookout for adventure. And one Friday night, after wrapping up my shift at McDonald's, I met up with some friends who suggested that we checked out this haunted location called White's Bridge. My one buddy, Brandon, said that he had recently learned about it and began telling us the legends associated with the 100-year-old wood-covered bridge. Never one to turn down a spooky experience, though. We all piled into my green Ford Taurus and headed out on our journey. Brandon gave directions, guiding me off the main road, and within minutes we were on the dirt back roads surrounded by woods and cornfields. Our only point of reference was a blinking cell tower off in the distance, but we could tell that we were getting further from the city as our cell phones began slowly losing service. As we rode deeper and deeper into what legitimately felt like absolutely middle of nowhere, Brandon repeated the legend associated with the bridge. You see, back in the early 1900s, a local farmer discovered that his beloved wife had been cheating on him, and in a fit of rage, you get the story. After committing the act, the farmer left his home and wandered the dirt roads in a daze. He eventually came upon White's Bridge, where the realization of what he had done finally began to sink in, and he decided that he would rather not live than face the consequences of his actions. As far as I can tell now, the story is complete fiction, but at the time we totally believed it. So after a long and bumpy ride, Brendan instructed me to turn right on an off-road. I wouldn't have even noticed was there, to be honest, had he not pointed it out. I took the turn, and there before us was White's Bridge. It looked like something straight out of a horror film, if I'm being honest. An old wood-covered bridge, aged by time, sitting alone above a river deep in the middle of nowhere. We parked the car on the side of the road, and we got out to explore. Immediately catching our eyes, though, was a scarecrow lying abandoned at the entrance to the bridge. My friend Mike, who was known as somewhat of a risk-taker, and a stupid one at that, picked up the scarecrow and then lit it on fire, of all things. The hay body burst up into a ball of flames, and Mike waved it around proudly next to the old dry wood bridge. Quickly realizing the risk, too, I told him to throw the stupid thing into the river and put it out, which thankfully he did. After making sure that there weren't any rogue embers that could ignite the bridge, Brandon suggested that we get back into the car and pull it onto the bridge. He explained that the legend was that if you parked your car in the middle of the bridge, put it into neutral, and then shut off the engine, the spirit of the dead farmer would push the vehicle forward to get it off the bridge. So naturally, we had to try this. We piled back in and did exactly as he said. We parked halfway across the rickety old bridge and killed the engine. We sat in the pitch black, saying nothing, waiting for something, anything to happen. The only sounds were the creaking of the bridge, the river flowing beneath us, and then footsteps. Suddenly, the back driver's door side opens and a woman abruptly enters the back seat, cramming in next to my two friends back there. She looked to be in her late 20s, early 30s, long, straight black hair, slim and wearing a red plaid shirt and blue jeans. "I saw your fire signal for me," she said. What? Wait," I replied, totally freaked out and at a complete loss for words, to be honest. "I'm so glad you came. My boyfriend's car broke down that way. I need a ride back." My brain was doing its best to compute the situation. What? I'm sorry, but who are you?" I asked. "What are you doing out here?" "I told you," she responded curtly. "My boyfriend's car broke down over there. Can you please just give me a ride so I don't have to walk all the way back?" She was pointed ahead, towards a narrow road that forked off to the right on the other side of the bridge. My friend Mike, the scarecrow burner, and ever the gentleman, added, "I mean, if you need a place to stay, you're more than welcome to come crash at my place. I got plenty of drink and—" I interrupted him. "No, lady, listen, I'm sorry, I don't know who you are. You just got in my car and this is all really weird. You could be an axe murderer for all I know, and I'm sorry, you've got to get out, alright?" She glared at me in the rearview mirror, and if looks could kill, I would have been done for. "But you signaled for me," she responded in an irritated tone. "We weren't signaling for you, alright? Just get out." She let out an angry sigh and got out, walking back in the direction from which she came and disappearing into the night. I started the engine right up and looked at my friends, and they all had looks of disbelief on their face. Without saying a word, I put the car in drive and slowly rolled forward and off the bridge. We needed to turn around and go back across the bridge to get back to where we had come from, and the only way to do that was to pull onto the side road that the woman said her boyfriend's car had broken down on and then reverse. As I pulled onto the side road, my headlights illuminated the 3 posted signs that I hadn't been able to see from the bridge: "No trespassing," "Private property," and "Do not enter." And looking up the road, there was suddenly no sign of the woman anywhere. And quite honestly, it was as if she just had literally vanished. I didn't want to stick around, so I backed up and crossed the bridge again, and from there began the journey home. We really didn't have much to say on the ride home, to be honest. I think we all just were equally stunned. Except for Mike, who asked if he knew anyone that would be awake at this hour that he could score some weed from. I visited White's Bridge a couple of times after that, but nothing of note ever happened in my subsequent visits. Sadly, some delinquents burned down the old White's Bridge some years ago. It was rebuilt, but from what I hear, it's just not the same as the original. I don't have any plans to go back and check it out, but it was an interesting experience, to say the least. For the past 4 years, I've worked as a funeral director and embalmer at 2 different locations in separate buildings. In my line of work, of course, the nature of the work would be unsettling to most, I suppose you could say, especially the aspect of the tasks completed on the descendants themselves. As an embalmer, I've performed some gruesome actions, all for the betterment of someone's loved one's appearance and their expectations during the viewing, during their visitation period. But I'm telling you all of this to set the stage that I'm definitely not scared easily from the unsettling, and I've had a rock-solid stomach that could handle any smell or sight that we come across that any embalmer will see at some point. As there are 2 locations, though, that I frequently visited for my work, I'll label them 1 and 2, just for simplicity's sake. So, the first location. Coming back from a death call at a hospital at 2 a.m. into a 130-year-old funeral home with a descendant in the back of the van seems creepy enough to most, but it's the reality that most people don't realize is a fairly common occurrence. My first major encounter happened sometime after I arrived to the funeral home and starting my normal embalming procedures. During the procedures, of course, I'm not paying extreme attention to my surroundings of the room, but I had noticed just a sort of nausea of chill that wasn't normal, as I'd embalmed many times before and never noticed anything like this. I just shrugged it off, though, and continued on. But after I had completed, I walked into a casket showroom, which is directly next to the embalming room, and flipped on the lights. And in the corner, next to the end of 2 caskets, was what I can only describe as a black mist that seemed to sort of dissipate into the corner of the room. Plain as day, in the fully lit room, I was absolutely rocked by this realization that me and this descendant were not alone in the funeral home. Someone or something had been watching me the entire time. The second occurrence was when I was leaving one night around 11 p.m. after a long day of death calls and funerals. Every evening, when we leave, we would go from room to room and make sure every light is off to save on the electric bill. I had sat down in my car and looked up into one of the rooms on the 2nd level, and I had noticed that I had left a lamp on. I decided to not go back in and get it in the morning. No big deal, right? Yeah, I wish. The specific room was the location manager's office, and it looked as if the light was emanating from the middle of the room. Just some context too, the lamp in question was originally owned by the location manager's wife who had passed, and also went through the same funeral home that we worked at. He had brought it from home to use there in his office because it was no longer needed at his house. And that next day, I went up there to check on the room and turn the lamp off. The only problem was that the lamp emanating the light the night before was sitting in the middle of his desk, not even plugged in. I was the first employee there that morning, and no one had been there during the night for any reason at all. Also, when seeing the lamp on the night before, I know the funeral home was empty because I was the last person to leave. Now, these 2 occurrences aren't alone, but they are probably some of the most notable, because I guess I just can't really explain them away. There are several hundred times that I felt watched or something seems to move in the corner of my eye. There's also been many times when I hear someone whisper hello or hey in my ear. There are so many that it's hard to keep when or how they happen straight, to be honest, but I guess that's just the baggage with the job. The second location, though, at this location I actually lived in the top funeral home for a period of like 6 to 8 months. It was because it was free room and board in a fully furnished apartment, and the ease of being able to just wake up and clock in the morning without even having to drive anywhere is a luxury that most people don't think about. But the first happening was subtle, but not a completely subtle moment, I suppose. A few weeks into my initial move into the apartment upstairs of the funeral home, I was sleeping in my room upstairs and was awoken by the sounds of the stairs creaking as if someone was walking up them. It was 1 a.m, and I knew that no one was there but me. Because usually when a death call happens, I know about them because I'm called by my answering service to go and get them. I was sure that I was the only one there. At this point, I'm frozen in place, like who the heck would be there at this time of night without me knowing about it? All of the doors are locked to the funeral home, and so is my bedroom door. The freezing continues, though, until whatever it is outside my door comes to it and knocks on it twice. I say nothing, but after several moments of complete silence, the creaking starts again, but back down the stairwell. I sat totally still the rest of the night. I couldn't sleep at all. Thankfully, nothing else happened, but I was absolutely rattled by that experience. Whatever that was knew that I was up there. I didn't like that thought at all, too, but I had no other choice but to continue to live there because my financial position at the time, I couldn't really afford anything else. My second experience there was in the evening as well. I was eating a TV dinner in my kitchen there in the apartment. I looked up from my food and watched a doorknob turn, and the door opened as if someone just walked through and shut it back. I just sat there mouth agape and was totally flabbergasted. I was also there alone that night as well. There were no breezes or change in air pressure or anything that could account for the door's closure. I don't know what happened that night, but finally, and the most recent, yesterday I was sitting on the couch downstairs on break during the middle of the day. I was alone again. If there's nothing going on as far as funerals or arrangement conferences on the weekends, we keep the doors locked and the lights off. I rose from the couch and was walking into the main hall of the funeral home, and I noticed a man standing in the doors to the funeral chapel, and I said aloud, "Hey, you!" He didn't turn or say anything. He just walked away from me and turned the corner. I followed him into the chapel to try and get his attention. I rounded that same corner, and I did. I found absolutely nothing. By this time, I was freaking out. The man was wearing a navy blue sort of pinstripe suit with a white-collared button-up, grey, slicked-back hair, and was about the same height as me, I think. He was an older fellow and was a little hunched over in the back. For reference, I'm 6'2". I immediately called the manager of the funeral home, though, same as the other location, and told him what had happened and described this man. And he told me that I had probably seen his old manager, who also lived in the apartment that I did currently several years ago. And it was at that moment that everything began to make some sense. For reference, we live in a state infamous for human trafficking, and the event took place around 2 a.m. So my friend and I, both females, were driving down a road in the middle of nowhere, just to talk and clear our minds. And you know those roads out in the desert that stretch for miles with no lights, that get pitch black and a little bit spooky at night too? Well, it was one of those. But we were already a little bit paranoid, given that we were both small females late at night in the middle of nowhere. If anything were to happen, no one would be around to see it. And after probably 15 minutes of driving out into this area, without passing a single vehicle, a black, either very large truck or SUV, I can't really remember despite it only being a couple of days ago, comes up in the distance. They had their high beams on, so they would have seen that we were two females alone passing us. And immediately after passing us, they pull off and stop for a second, which alarmed us a bit, and then pulled a U-turn, driving in our direction, which obviously alarmed us a little bit more. The street was just a long stretch of straight road continuing for miles, which means that there was no logical reason for them to have turned around like that. Based on the layout of the land, this is not the kind of place that you can make a wrong direction in. But regardless, if you're suspicious, it gets worse. So they speed up until they're directly behind us, blinding us with their lights, which scared us even more. And the next event made our stomachs drop and our breathing stop. They turned their lights off. We couldn't see them anymore, aside from the brief shadow of a vehicle if I really squinted into the dark, and to say that we were terrified was an understatement. All of the worst case scenarios were playing out in our heads, We had never been in this area before and we were now alone. But we didn't want to call the cops as they were notoriously unreliable. But we were in the middle of nowhere and we also had weed in the car. Despite this, though, we felt safe knowing, despite unreliable, that we were in a vehicle. And as long as we didn't stop or get out, we should be safe. And so we did. For 30 minutes, but what felt like a lot longer than that, this vehicle followed us with the lights off, and we never passed a single other vehicle on the road, in fact. After driving back into civilization, finding a route that had no U-turns required, despite how much longer it would take, the vehicle got off once there were street lights and buildings in sight. So last week I was at home watching a movie. I was reclined in my chair, which faces a window that faces another building with a small amount of grass between them. I live in a basement apartment, so the windows are at ground level. They're about 2 feet tall and 3 feet wide. So I doze off and fall into a deep sleep. My dog is sleeping on my lap. I'll mention that my dog barks at any animal or wind rustling leaves outside this window. I know people ever walk by it, given its location, but occasionally a bird will come by it or something like that. I wake up abruptly from my sleep with an intense alertness. My eyes open wide quickly, like sort of instinctual response. I remember immediately feeling like I was being watched. Simultaneously, I look straight at the window and I'm staring right at this face. Our eyes are locked on each other. I remember feeling nothing but extreme alertness and fear at this point, but also very calm, weirdly. I had this absolute knowing that it had been watching me sleep for a while. It felt more curious than threatening, I suppose. Whatever it was bizarre to say the least, and I just felt like I couldn't move, like I was hypnotized. Anyway, we stare at each other for like a solid 20 or so seconds. I'm just lying there, still unblinking. My mind was shifting through possibilities to rationalize logically what it could be. I wanted so badly to believe that it was just an animal, but its face was bare of fur with sort of human-colored skin. It was very small, no way it could have been human. It had to be the size of like a 1-year-old child, if that by the size of its face. I couldn't see its body because it was dark outside, but my apartment was lit by my Christmas lights, and it looked like it was leaned in on its arms with its face as close to the window as possible. But what was particularly strange to me is that my dog wasn't barking. He just lied there, still with me. This is when I think, too, that I might have been having, like, sleep paralysis or something. I have sleep paralysis quite often, and this didn't feel like it. It felt more like a trance state. I felt connected to it somehow. I finally get the nerve to sit up and take a closer look and mumble, "What the?" And that's when it backs away. I remember my thought process being in slow motion and clear. I tell myself to listen closely to see if I can hear 4 legs or 2. It just gets up and runs away, and this is when my dog finally starts barking. That was when I knew for sure as well that I wasn't imagining it. I mean, I hear it run distinctly on 2 feet. It sounded really small, whatever it was. I could tell by the sound of its sort of gating walk that it was very small. And in the end, I just sat there confused, my dog going crazy. I checked the time, and it's 4:47 in the morning. And guys, I have no idea what to think. It does correlate with one thing, though. You see, in late August, I started building a shrine or a temple type thing out in the woods at a large nature park. It was my favorite spot to go and meditate or practice my harmonica or write. It became an encompassing sort of spiritual ritual, I guess you could say, to go out there. The whole thing was a meditation type practice, and it's basically a big teepee made from dead tree trunks and branches, with a stacked stick circle inside of it. I had worked tirelessly out there, being in a kind of union with nature in my mind as I built it. I meditated and carried the meditation out with action. I remember one night too at like 1 a.m. a friend and I were sitting out there. We were in the middle of a conversation when my friend's face turns into a sort of panic worry. I stop talking and can hear footsteps coming towards us. It was already loud and distinct enough, as if close to us, I think. But we sat and listened for a long time as it kept walking closer, but never actually got to us, which was weird. We decided to leave though, and she really doesn't like talking about it because of the feeling of the energy and air as we acknowledged it. Anyways, someone totally destroyed my shrine in October, and I just left it as it is. It sort of crushed me a bit, and I would often visit the ruins a bit heartbroken. But to wrap this tangent up, the day that this happened, the creature watching me sleep that is, was the same day that I went out there and suddenly felt a strong urge to rebuild it. I cleared everything and started again, and after a few hours I came home and fell asleep, and then all of this happened. I don't know if any of it means anything, but what do you guys think? This happened when I was about 14 or 15. I'm 19 now. I was in my house's basement playing PlayStation absentmindedly late into the night, like I did often at the time. Being up till like 3 or 4 in the morning was not unusual for me at this time. How my house is structured too is that it has a front door, but also a second set of front doors if you go down the driveway. The basement is by these second doors too. So, as I was getting ready to log off for the night, I heard my dog started going crazy from upstairs. They sometimes bark at nothing, a car passing in the night or too much wind whipping past their window or something. However, as someone who listened to too many scary stories, that was more than enough for me to go and check it out. So I went upstairs and was about to go straight to my room when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the window. I looked through my window to the front yard, but I couldn't see anything. And suddenly I heard my dad yell in a voice lower than his own, "Hey, can I help you?" This is what set me into pure adrenaline mode. I stood frozen, staring out of the window as my ears strained to hear the guy's response. I still got nothing before my dad continued, "Sorry, you have the wrong house, get off the property." And it was at this point that whoever this person was comes into sightline. It was a man wearing a white sleeveless shirt and cargo pants, and I watched as he walked off our front path and onto the street, and then back onto the path, and he was seemingly unsure of where to go or what to do, I think. It was at this point that I realized with utter dread I didn't lock the downstairs front door. I finally break my frozen spell and run back down the stairs and lock the front door. I take a deep breath and start back towards the stairs when I hear it. The door handle jiggling. I don't even look back. I just book it up the stairs and into my parents' room. My dad had already called the cops. They came about half an hour later and seemingly picked up the guy from an empty house down the street that was in the process of being sold. And the following day, when my dad was checking the newspaper, it told of an escaped convict from the max security prison here. Some sort of mix-up was made, and they let the wrong person out apparently. They caught him, luckily enough, but didn't detail where. But it was obvious, based on some of the information within the article, that this was the dude that we saw that night. And that is how I both forgot and remembered my way through a very creepy experience. As a child, I think kindergarten age, I loved to talk. If anyone had a question for me, I would gleefully give them way too much information. Most people found it endearing and would praise me for being so smart, which often encouraged me a lot. But some people found it annoying, obviously. Now, my mum and I normally shopped at the market just a few minutes away from our house. My mum had been shopping there for like 20-some years at that point, and was friends with most of the workers there, so I was friendly with them too, and always was happy to talk with them. Whenever my mum got distracted talking to someone, I, with the attention span of a 6-year-old, would wander around the aisles just looking at things. My mum would keep an eye on me to make sure that I didn't go too far, but if she was distracted, one of the employees would usually be around and gently guide me back over. One day, though, we went to a different market that I couldn't remember having been to before, and we didn't go back for nearly a decade, mind you. We were walking around the aisles when my mum ran into a friend. They started talking, and I, not realizing that I no longer had a store full of adults keeping an eye on me, that is, started wandering around the aisles. My eyes caught some colourful display, I think flowers or balloons or something, and I went over to look. Once I was satisfied with my inspection, I turned back to the aisle, only to find that my mum wasn't there. That had never happened before. I looked around a little, though not moving from my spot near the colourful displays. Since it was right near the registers, there was a decent amount of people nearby, which I'm thankful for now. But as I was looking around, an employee came up to me. He was older than my sister. She was 12 or 13 at the time, and younger than my dad, in his mid-40s, which was about the only way that I could gauge the age. But nowadays I would say that he was probably in his early to mid-20s, if I remember it correctly. "Hi there," he said sweetly, in that tone that you normally speak to kids in. I cheerfully said hello, actually stepping a little closer. "Hey, are you looking for your mum?" I say yes, happily explaining that I had last seen her talking to a friend and that I could normally find her easily when I wandered away, so I wasn't sure where she could have gone. "Does she leave you alone often?" "Not really. My older sister was normally with me if my mum wasn't. She was 12 or 13 and she was super mature, so if my mum had to leave me for a little bit, she knew that I would be okay. Plus, she never really left us alone in public, just at home if she needed to run somewhere. Never for very long too, just the length of time for a Pokemon episode or something. And my dad was at work a lot and didn't come back home until late, usually anyway. Just if you guys were wondering. But then he said, "Where do you live?" And well, wouldn't you know it, I had just learned my address. We just learned how to mail a letter in school, even took a little class trip to the mailbox in our school corner to send them out. I knew how to write my address now, and I knew how to say it, and want to hear? Of course you do. I know kids are naive, but I was downright dumb at this age. I was diagnosed with colorblindness 2 years later, otherwise known as red-green colorblindness. It makes sense, as I was totally blind to all the red flags too. "So, where do you go to school? And who picks you up?" "Well, I go to the local elementary school. I don't know the address though. Sorry," I tell him. "But I know what street it's on because I wait on the sidewalk for my mum or daycare sitter, depending on the day, so I see the street sign a lot since I'm usually waiting for a while to be grabbed." "Hey, do you like animals? Like puppies?" "Dogs scare me, cats scare me, pigeons scare me, fish scare me, flies scare me. You know what doesn't scare me though? Turtles. I have 5 turtles. No dogs that might bark or bite if somebody drops by the house, like our neighbour does. Those dogs are always behind the gate though, so they don't scare me that much. But at this stage, it had only been a few minutes since I last saw my mum, even with how much information I was dumping. I was a very fast talker. But I was starting to get a little bit antsy. Not because I was uncomfortable talking to a stranger, but because I had skipped lunch that day, specifically to con my mum into letting me get a bagel from the store next door, which was exactly why we were at the market in the first place. My mum was holding onto the bagel to make sure I didn't try to eat it too fast and choke, which I had done several times in the past. And quite frankly, I just wanted my bagel. And while I liked to talk to this grown man who made me feel smart and was oh so interested in my life, I liked bagels a lot more. Plus, if I caught my mum when we were near the bakery section, I might be able to use my charm and cuteness to get a cookie. So I gotta find my mum now. "Oh, well, how about I walk around with you and help you find her? You want to lead me through the market that you work at, where you can easily bring me to the back room, the meat locker, or any number of places?" "Yeah, sure, sounds good," I thought. "Ozzy!" I look around to see my mum, the relieved look on her face slowly changing into something more anxious. I smile happily and I wave her over. She immediately grabs my hand, and I can tell that she wants to chide me, probably for leaving the aisle, but she seems more occupied on the man in front of me. Before I can even open my mouth to introduce him, or remember that I never actually got his name, he quickly says that he's glad that I found my mum and he needs to get back to work, and practically runs to the back of the store. My mum puts her hands on my shoulders and looks me in the eye, her expression a lot more worried now. "What was he talking about to you?" she asked, her voice more serious than I had ever heard. "Can I have my bagel?" My mum opens her mouth, pauses, and goes into her purse to hand me my bagel. Between bites, I happily tell her about the conversation and everything that I remembered. My age and grade, my pickup schedule, likes and dislikes, my literal address. And my mum gradually became paler, then became red with anger. She brought me over to the manager, and I don't really remember much about the conversation, but I got a cookie. I remember that pretty well because it was shaped like a watermelon, which was apparently far more important to me than paying attention to what was being said. I do remember, though, that the police weren't called. We went home, and my mum told me that I wasn't allowed to walk around the store anymore like that. No more talking to any strangers, even if they worked at the store that we were at, unless she was with me, that was. If I ever was to see that man again, I was to run away, find someone that I know, and ask for help. And if all else fails, scream at the top of my lungs, just like when a fly lands on me. By the way, I still hate insects. I agree pleasantly, not really fazed by anything that she's saying. I know that some people are bad, of course, but the bad people look bad, right? They talk mean and look scary and try to grab you. This man, he didn't, so he wasn't bad to me. But if my mum was saying it, then I guess I had no choice but to listen. And I better enjoy that cookie because we apparently weren't going back to that store ever again. Tears incoming. In exchange, though, I can get a donut once a month from our usual store. Tears cancelled. When I was around 12, our school had a safety assembly and was talking about the shady things that adults do to get close to kids, and a very, very watered-down version of what they most likely wanted. And I'm sitting there listening, and suddenly realize, oh, if my mum hadn't have found me, something really terrible might have happened. If not in the store, then in front of my school, and if not in front of my school, then perhaps even at my house. A little over a decade now. I'm 18 now, and I've never seen the guy again, not even at that store, which is odd because we went back there a couple of times, and I don't think he actually worked there. This happened about a year ago, and there were just so many terrible factors working against me that night that I'm honestly astounded that I got away unscathed. At least physically, that is. This all begins when I'm at my friend's apartment, who lives in a really rough part of town. In a series of poor decisions, that night I decided to get belligerently drunk and take a few pills of who knows what. And yes, I know. Safe to say, though, that after a solid night of partying, around 4 AM, I was definitely not in the right state of mind. My drug-addled brain decides that instead of staying that night at my friend's apartment like I normally would, I wanted to Uber back to my own apartment instead. My friend's apartment had two separate entrances, or exits to the building, one in the back unlit parking lot of the building and one facing the street. They had two sets of keys for each door, and I only had keys to one in the back of the apartment. Since my Uber would obviously arrive at the street, and the door in the front of the building locks itself behind you, I exited this way when the driver was soon to arrive. Looking back, standing outside that apartment, I realized that I must have looked like the easiest target on the planet. I'm a small petite female in my early 20s, and I can hardly stay upright. I'm using a street lamp to prop myself up, and not doing a good job at that either. The light was basically a beacon for any nearby predators, saying, "Come and get me." I'm not paying attention to any of my surroundings at all in this state. despite the fact that there was literally a bullet hole in the front door that I came out of, which is not good. I do remember checking to see what car I was getting picked up in, and was only able to pick out the fact that it was a black sedan. Soon after stepping outside, a black sedan pulls up to the curb and starts rolling down the window, so I step forward. Now, before this man even spoke, I could feel that something was just wrong. He had an expression like he was tearing me apart with just his eyes, and after seeing that look, it gave me a new meaning to the word predator to describe a criminal, because I then knew what it felt like to be prey. He basically barks at me, "I'm your Uber driver." This was the second red flag that somehow made its way through my brain. Normally Uber drivers just roll down their window and they say your name, but I think I just stared at him for a second, my brain slowly piecing together the situation that I was potentially in, and I ask him, "What's my name?" He immediately is enraged and starts screaming about how he doesn't have time for this and just get in the car, etc., etc. Quite honestly, I don't think that I've ever sobered up so fast in my life before. I'm completely panicking. Obviously, this wasn't my Uber. Quickly checking the license plate, I immediately see that it's not a match. Meanwhile, this guy is still screaming at me, and I have absolutely no idea what to do. If I bolt in either direction, this guy could easily outrun me or have a weapon or something. I'm also pretty sure at this point that if he's trying to nab a random girl off the street, he must have a weapon of some sort. I can't run back into the apartment door right behind me since it locks right behind you, and I don't have the keys, nor time to unlock it. Running towards the back door would do nothing as well, as he's idling right by the mouth of the driveway towards the back parking lot, and again I would have to take the time to find the right keys and get in. If I screamed, I'm not exactly in the right type of neighborhood where someone would try to be a vigilante, and I can still hear the music radiating from my friend's third-floor apartment, and I just knew that they weren't about to hear me. Also, it's 4 in the morning, and absolutely nobody is around. People talk a lot about these sorts of situations where they either sprint into action or they freeze, but I felt incapable of doing either one of those things. It was the absolute worst feeling that I've ever felt in my life, though. Everything in me wanted to run, but I felt that if I did, that it was going to be the end of me. But if I kept standing there staring in shock at this screaming man, the result would be the same. From when he started screaming at me up until this point, I'm guessing it was only about 20 seconds that had passed. And just as he's looking like he's getting ready to get out of the car, another black sedan pulls up right behind him. Checking the license plate as quickly as I can, I realize that it's my actual Uber, and I make a full sprint to the car, really only like 6 steps, and throw myself in, screaming at my real Uber driver, "What's my name?" The poor dude looks terrified, but responds with my name quickly, to which I reply, "Get me out of here, this man is trying to kidnap me." If I was in this Uber driver's position, I think I would have been too shocked to react as quickly as he did, but my dude, he flew out of there, offered to call the cops for me, which I declined, and now regret too, and then walked me to the front door of my apartment, ensuring that I got inside safely. Truly an incredible human being. You can rest easy too, knowing that he got the fattest tip my college student bank account would allow for, although he deserved much, much more than that. I'm very confident in saying that I think that man, he may have just saved my life that night. This happened back in September of 2019 when I was 15. Just to set the scene as well, my kitchen and dining room, they're connected with the kitchen window facing out to the front garden with no trees or plants in them. This will be important later. So a couple of weeks prior to the main event, I came downstairs to get some cereal at around 10 p.m. I was pouring the cereal when I heard one faint, light tap against the window. I stopped and took a minute to think about what I just heard and whether it was in my head or if someone had actually just tapped on the window. However, I wasn't going to open the blinds to find out because, well, I believe in ghosts and I'm scared of dark places, plus there could have been somebody out there, so I was pretty much just out of there. I did forget about what happened until a few weeks later, early September, when I was coincidentally going down late at night, maybe 1 a.m. I think, to get some cereal again, but as I was getting everything out, I heard one solid tap on the window, then another and another one, but weirdly in a sort of regular pattern, and the tap sounded like somebody's finger was tapping on the glass, which made it even creepier, obviously. The part that sent chills down my spine this time was the fact that the blinds were open, so I didn't want to look outside. I quickly just walked up the stairs like there was no tomorrow, and I knocked on my mum's door to tell her what had happened. Obviously she was asleep, but I was crapping bricks, so it was always comforting to speak about things with her. But as I walked into her room, the light from the hallway faintly filled the room, where I saw this huge shadow hovering above my mum's bed. This all happened within about 2 seconds, but it appeared to flutter some wings or something, and then it just dove straight towards me. I closed my eyes out of fear of what I just saw, and I don't really remember much for the next 2-minute period, so this is all according to my mum, but apparently I just stood there hyperventilating with my eyes sealed shut. It took me a solid minute to calm my breathing down to a normal pace, where I then finally came to, and just decided to call it a night. Safe to say that I laid in my bed that night with the lights on, and it was a very sleepless night. This happened a week ago, and my blood still runs cold when I think about it. So my brother wanted to get a drink from a place that we both loved to go to. It was going to close soon, and he had work to do, so I went by myself. It wasn't very late, but it was already dark, and my parents had drummed into me since birth about the dangers of walking alone at night. I was kind of nervous that day, I'll admit, even though I've done it many times before. But I went and got both drinks, and for some reason I forgot to bring a bag. I was walking along with both hands full, bad idea mind you. As I was walking towards the street where my house was, I suddenly became aware of 2 men very near me. One was in front of me wearing a maroon pullover, and the other was behind me wearing a grey zipped-up hoodie with the hood pulled up. I only really turned around for a flash of a second, so I couldn't describe his face to you. I was weirded out, though, because I was walking between them, and I was beginning to feel uncomfortable, like they were trying to hurt me or something. And just as I was telling myself that I was clearly overreacting, I came across a garage that was down an alleyway, and a black Subaru was coming out of it. I had time, so I crossed before they reached me. The person inside clearly wasn't counting on me doing that, so they sort of swung around and parallel parked next to me, at most only 2 feet away. So now I was between 3 men and a wall. When I saw that door open, that was it for me. I just bolted, and I didn't stop running until I reached my house. This happened about maybe 11 months ago when me and my wife got married in June. I will never be so grateful that I have a habit of locking doors. So our wedding day was coming to an end. Family and friends were slowly starting to depart as me and my wife Diana took pictures and chatted with some of the guests who stayed a little longer and were just having a good time. It was a great day too, and a lot of fond memories were made, but what was least expected is what happened that night as we were on our way to our honeymoon. As me and Diana said goodbye to the last of the guests, 9 p.m., we got in the car and we headed home. We had our bags packed prior to the wedding day for Cancun, and we were ready to go. I live in WA, and we were in a bit of a hurry because instead of flying out from the Seattle airport in SeaTac, like normal people do, it was a lot cheaper for us to drive up north to Canada and fly out from the Canadian airport. Also, me and my wife thought that it'd be fun to have a sort of little road trip to Canada and then fly out from Canada to Cancun. Plus, it was only a 3.5-hour drive for us, and cheaper too, so we headed out, 12 a.m. We had a great time too, just driving and blasting music, talking about Cancun, and just being excited about the new next chapter in our lives. Diana slowly started to fall asleep, being exhausted from the wedding and whatnot. We were halfway to Canada. At this point, too, we were no longer in the city area, but more a wooded area with fewer cars and fewer people the more that we drove, practically seeing no one on the road. By that time, it was around 3 a.m. We had some extra time on our hands, and I was starting to fall asleep too, so I just sort of pulled over to a gas station to get some Red Bull to keep me awake and whatnot. I pulled into the gas station that was completely empty, and parked the car to see Diana asleep. I told her that I'm taking the keys and that I would lock her inside and that I would be right back. Not sure if she could hear me, but she kind of motioned her hand around like people normally do when they're just too tired to care. I came back around 6 minutes later to find my wife shaking and crying. I was confused and freaking out a bit because I wasn't sure why she was crying. She couldn't even get words out at first, but later, once she calmed down, she told me this. So apparently, she did hear me when I told her that I'd take the keys and be right back, and as she was sleeping, she was woken by a tapping on the driver's side window. Being too tired to get up, though, or even open her eyes, she lazily went for the unlock button on the passenger side of the door, assuming that it was me. As she was going for it, though, she just sort of froze, and a thought passed her mind. Then she remembered, didn't he say that he had his keys? Why would he need me to unlock the door for him? That's when she heard a woman's voice mumbling from the driver's side. She turned herself around to look at the window, and she saw a woman. Long black hair with wide eyes and a sort of crooked smile on her face. She couldn't really hear what she was saying at first, but then as she listened closely, she could hear it. She kept repeating in a sort of mumbled tone, "Are you tired?" just over and over. She really freaked out and told the woman to just leave her alone. The woman allegedly laughed and told my wife that she was tired too. The woman never took her eyes off of her and tried the door handle at one point. At this point too, my wife was close to tears and attempted to call me, but as she did, she heard what sounded like a phone buzz and realized that I'd left my phone in the car. Out of options now, my wife started to honk the horn trying to scare off the woman while also maybe getting my attention. The woman still had her gaze on her and started mumbling more while laughing and trying the door handle again. Then she mentioned something about someone named Sarah and asked my wife if she knew her. After a few more minutes of this mumbling, she eventually left, and to my wife's word, the minute that she left, I came out of the gas station. So my wife broke down. I still don't know how I didn't hear the honking of the car, and I still feel bad for leaving my phone in the car like that. My wife has also added that one of the creepier things about that woman is that she didn't look homeless or dirty or anything. In fact, she looked completely normal and well kept. My wife said that she'll never forget the woman's wide eyes and the gaze that she had on her with that smile. It also chills me to think what would have happened if my wife never realized that I had the keys, or if she never had heard me about locking her inside and opened the door while faced the other way or something. I don't know what those women's intentions were, but if I couldn't hear the honk of the horn, then I'm definitely sure that there's no way that I would have heard screams. So basically, I've lived in this house for most of my life now. It's small and in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing out of the ordinary ever really happens here. But lately, over the past year, I've just had some weird experiences. I'll share 3 main ones that really shake me whenever I think about them. So, the first one happened about 6 months ago. I usually get home from school around 4:30ish because I have swim practice when school ends. My mum usually gets home at around 6, and almost every day I follow the same routine. Get home, eat a snack, watch a bit of TV, do some homework on the couch, and that's about it. Today was pretty much no different, and as soon as I got my snack, I sat down on the couch and began to watch some TV. After about an hour of watching TV, I started to feel super groggy out of nowhere and could barely keep my eyes open. I woke up about 30 minutes later to my mum shaking me, telling me to open all of the windows. Apparently, when she got home, the carbon monoxide alarm was going off, so she checked the heater in the kitchen. When she walked into the kitchen, all of the stove burners were turned on to where there was no fire, but gas was just leaking out everywhere. She blamed it on me, but I specifically remember not using the stove, and if I did, why would I turn on all of the burners anyway? That was the first encounter, too, that made me feel like something was off in this house. The second encounter happened a few months after the first. My mum and I were building a dresser from IKEA, and we needed a screwdriver. We always keep a bag of house tools in the hall closet and more outside in the garage. She sent me to go and get some tools from the tool bag in the hall closet. But when I got there was no screwdrivers in there. Like, none. No flathead or star ones, no small or large or any. All of the rest of the tools were there though, so I told her, and she said that was weird, but to go and check in the garage. I went into the garage, and once again there were absolutely no screwdrivers, and I was like, what the heck is going on? Anyways, I went back inside and I told my mum, and of course she was like, I guess I'll have to go and get them myself. So we both checked the hall closet. None were there. The garage, again, none were there. Coming back into the house, we stopped in the kitchen and talked about how weird that was because we hardly ever used the tools, so where could they have gone? We walked down the hall into the living room and both of us immediately gasped because on the middle of the carpet is a pile of 10 to 15 screwdrivers just sitting there. We both looked at each other out of confusion, and I also think a little bit of fear. This third one happened about a week ago, and is honestly the scariest one. It gives me goosebumps just talking about it, in fact. One night, I was sitting at my computer watching YouTube. It was a little bit late, around 2 or 3 in the morning, I think. I always leave the hall light on with my door shut because I'm afraid of the dark, and it gives me just a little bit of light. So I'm watching YouTube, and I kept hearing my mum walking from her room to the living room, which is weird because I remember her going to bed a couple of hours ago, and she's a really heavy sleeper who doesn't wake up for pretty much anything, so I called out to her, but nobody answered. So I was like, well, that's weird. And then I heard the footsteps again, so I looked under the door, and I could have sworn that I saw like a shadow of feet standing there, and I thought it was my mum, so I was like, why doesn't she open the door? So I got up and opened the door, but when I did, there was nobody there. I went into my mum's room, and she was dead asleep, like snoring and everything, and I was immediately creeped out, so I woke her up and was like, why do you keep walking down the hall? And she was like, what? I've been asleep since like 11. In the end, I just sort of brushed it off as just my imagination, so I went back into my room and sat down at my computer and watched my show for like another 20 more minutes. But then I hear a click of the light switch out in the hall. I looked under the door and it was pitch black, and I was like, what? So I opened my door and the light was off. And I know that I left it on because, well, I always do. So I woke my mum up again and was like, did you turn the light off? And she was like, no. And so I was even more creeped out, and I ended up sleeping with my room lights on after that. Anyways, there's a lot of other small things that have happened in my house too, like sometimes doors will open on their own, or I can hear something walking around and stuff moving at night. I always feel like I'm being watched as well, or that there's something here with me. And the whole vibe of our house just feels off and really scary. I don't know what changed or how this happened, but if anyone has any ideas, then please comment or give me some advice or something. I've tried using sage, by the way, to clean the house of negative energy, because I heard that can work, but that just hasn't seemed to do anything. I just really don't know anything about any of this stuff, and I feel like I'm just way out of my depth. About a year ago, I was living with my mate. I stayed in a ground floor flat that kind of sits in a cul-de-sac and is a bit of a pain to walk to, I'll admit. Kind of detached from the community. The only times I ever felt completely secure are during sunlight, depending on the time of year. The block of flats is kind of an L shape. Our entrance sits kind of inside that 90-degree angle. Inside the main building, there's a flat either side and stairs in front. The immediate entrance hall is very dark. I feel like the lights choose when and when not to work as well. The flats are basic. A hallway, 2 double-door bedrooms, a bathroom, decent living room and small kitchen. The hallway is quite long and the living room is at the end of it. Both bedrooms face each other, so we can talk from our doorways, if that makes sense. I'm telling you this too because it'll help you picture the incident. So, it was about 11:30 at night, and my flatmate was in her room, presumably sleeping. She had a habit of leaving things unlocked, and I have to make sure everything is locked up before I head off to sleep. But she'd gotten better, and normally at least had the chain on the door, if it wasn't locked, that is. She always goes to bed early though, so it wasn't weird or anything. I was in the living room and decided to grab a pint of water before heading to bed myself. I went into the kitchen, which is attached to the living room, switching on the kitchen light and filling up a glass. The car park in front of the flat was really dark. I remember feeling kind of eerie that night too, and I just wasn't sure why, but I just felt like something was off. If I had to describe it, it was that kind of feeling that you get when you switch the light off and you run up the stairs. Anyway, I had a couple of sips and filled the glass a little more, and headed out to the kitchen when the front doorbell went. I sort of froze. I didn't even know that we had a doorbell, to be honest. About 10 seconds passed before the letterbox was hit twice and my stomach sank. I sort of felt trapped in the kitchen. Important to note 2 things here as well. 1, if you step out of the kitchen, it puts you in perfect line with the hallway if the living room door is open, which it was at that time. And 2, our front door has a bloody window, so you can see the silhouettes of anyone outside or in. Us being girls, we had a sort of cute grey curtain across it, but it was pretty much see-through. So I grabbed my phone and I called my mate, who was in her room, right next to the front door. We both whispered, "Did you hear that?" Both thinking that we may have misheard it. We had to whisper too because the walls were like paper thin in that flat. You could always hear people coming and going in the close. She came to her bedroom doorway, but couldn't go forward because then she'd be in direct sight of the window. I edged my way out of the kitchen, keeping flat against the wall, eventually sinking to the floor, texting her now because we were both closer to the door and whoever was out there would probably hear us. Another thing that you should probably know is that this person must have buzzed other flats to get into the building, but didn't buzz ours. So I reckon that they must have seen me from the kitchen window. I'm a fairly ordinary-looking 120-pound girl, but lying in kind of an army crawl, I saw the silhouette of a tall, broad, bald man. It could have only been a man as well, because he was so tall and broad. He tapped the letterbox again, but just sort of stood there. Terrified now, I mouthed to my mate, "Did you lock the door?" And she looked at me with a horrified expression on her face and mouthed, "No." The chain wasn't on the door either. Now or never, I supposed. I crawled as low as I could into my bedroom, crawled up to my desk, grabbed my keys, crawled to the door. It's only about 1 meter. And frantically shoved the keys in the lock and twisted, at the same time putting the chain on. This is a noisy affair too, and he obviously noticed that I was there, hitting the letterbox again and trying to handle as I desperately tried to twist the crap old school key in the lock, and eventually I got it. Terrified to stand, my mate put her head out her room to see if we were cool, and he wasn't there anymore. In a kind of half-stoned, half-asleep stupor, she reckoned to just go back to bed. But something was just nagging at me, though, really badly. Remember how I said that we could hear people coming and going really easily? It was just eerily quiet, and not once did either of us hear the building's main door open or close. Which meant that this was probably somebody in this building. He had one person across from us, two people above us, and two above them. Two of those flats are students. A neighbour across was a 98-year-old woman. There was a couple and a sort of short, long-haired chill guy. Nobody we knew matched the frame of the man in our flat window, but I stayed up until I couldn't anymore, texting mates, just sort of jamming in my room, door shut, keeping my hockey stick next to my bed. But I realised about a month after this that the service button to the front of the main building was actually broken, and anyone could have come in if they pressed it, and could be unheard coming in if they were very quiet, and knew that they had to be very careful with the door as it was old and heavy. I still think, though, that they must have seen me in the kitchen in the light and thought that they were trying their luck. And this could have easily been a very different story if I hadn't have locked the door when I did. Always lock your doors, people. Double check them too, because no matter how safe you reckon your area is, it just may not be. We have literally no idea to this day who that was or why they knocked like that, but we never heard anyone again use that doorbell. I'll start by saying that I'm 19 years old and these hauntings occurred from 7 to 8 years old. I'm not a religious person at all. In fact, I'm one of those people that has to see something to believe it. When people tell me stories of how this or that happened to them, I always try to come up with a logical explanation for what they experienced. That being said, this shook me to my core, and I avoid sharing what happened to me with other people simply because I cannot even think about this time in my life without swelling up in tears. So, as a child, I didn't like scary movies, ghost stories, none of that stuff really. I was scared of the dark and bedtime, and for me it was a struggle because my mother would have to sit beside my bed until I went to sleep before she was able to leave the room. After I would fall asleep, I would always wake up at around 2 a.m. and be scared that I was alone and walk to my mother's room down the hall to get into bed with her and go back to sleep. The only people in the house during this time were my older sister, Mum, and me. Now, the first incident I had occurred when I woke up in the middle of the night again and I got up to go to my mother's room. When I got to her room and opened the door, that was when I saw it. An extremely pale, short, bald man was sitting in the middle of her bed. I was paralyzed in fear and just stared at this guy for a few seconds, trying to understand what I was looking at. The man's head rose and he looked at me as I stood in the doorway. His face was completely smooth, no eyes, mouth, or anything, just a powdered white face. The moment that I saw him look up at me too, I immediately collapsed into the floor and started screaming and crying and calling for my mother to wake up. My mum jumped up out of bed and ran over to me and tried to calm me down. I was trying to tell her that there was a man in her room, but she kept telling me that it was just a bad dream, that I needed to go back to bed. I quickly looked around the room, intending to show her, but I didn't see the man anywhere. When I calmed down a bit, I asked if me and her could both stay in my room for the night because I was too frightened to sleep alone, but I definitely didn't want to go back into her room after that. The morning after, I tried to explain to my mum what I had seen the night before, but she just didn't want to hear it. She shrugged it off and told me that it was just a bad dream again. I was so sure what I had seen, though, and I tried to tell my sister, but she just dismissed me as well. After this experience, I was terrified that it would happen again, though. The following nights were horrible, too. My mother would tuck me into bed like usual and wait until I fell asleep to leave. Except now, I was freaking out that I was asleep, so she would go into her room. But when she left, I would get up and turn on all the lights in my room, and I would just play around with my action figures or play on my PlayStation. I would do this until the next morning, in fact. It was during the day that I would take naps on the couch, but my mother didn't like that. She wanted to get out and play during the day so that I was able to sleep well at night. And obviously, this led to me losing an insane amount of sleep because I was too scared to sleep at night, but my mum wasn't going to let me sleep at all throughout the day. It had been around 2 or 3 weeks, I would say, since the first incident happened, and I was starting to think that maybe Mum was right and that it had all been a dream. One day I was particularly exhausted and fell asleep on the couch in the living room and slept until the middle of the night. I woke up to a pitch-black room and immediately began to have a panic attack. Even when I woke up in my own room, I always had night lights that always stayed on. I got off of the couch and tried to use the power light on the TV to sort of help me to have a point to walk to, because my room was the first room in the hall coming out of the living room. And when I got to my room and opened the door, there was that man sitting on the edge of my bed now. Now, as terrified as I was, I slowly closed my door back shut, hoping that the man hadn't seen me open the door, and I immediately ran to my mum's room, screaming and crying again, telling her that he was in my room. She gets up and walks with me to my room, and again, there isn't anything there. I remember just being so confused at that time and questioning what was real and what wasn't. I told my mum that I wanted to go stay with my dad because I was too scared to stay with her anymore. And after contacting my dad, I told him everything that had been happening at my mum's. He talked to her and decided that I could come live with him. Talking to my dad about it was really tough too, because he didn't really believe in what I was saying. He also thought that I was just having bad dreams because I was watching scary movies or something at my mother's. But fast forward a few years and my mum is remarried with a man that had 3 children, the youngest of which was 6 years old. Over the time that they stayed in the house, the youngest boy started to experience similar things to what I had. When my mum told me that he was saying the same things that I was when I stayed there, I wanted to be like, "I told you so." But at this point, my mum believed me, and she actually sold the house not long after. Nowadays, we just sort of refer to our old house as the haunted house. It's really hard to talk to other people in person about it though, because for some reason it makes my eyes water, and I just feel terrified even thinking about it. Anyway, I just thought that I would share this here with you guys because, well, it's good to get it off my chest. This happened to my mum about a year ago while she was visiting me. I woke up to get a drink around 4 AM one night. My mum works 3rd shift, so she was still awake and I decided to hang out with her. She told me that she had just got back from the 24/7. When my mum was on her way back from the store though, around 3:30 AM, she could see what looked like a person crawling on the road. She rolled her window down, and as she got closer she could hear a woman screeching absolute bloody murder. My mum described her as looking like her jaw was about to unhinge. My mum isn't easily fooled, but she wasn't going to just flat out ignore the situation either. She remained in a locked car and yelled out to see if the woman was okay and maybe if she needed the cops. The girl just starts going on about how her parents are after her or something. As the girl is rambling, my mum sees a car coming up from the other direction. My mum yells at her to get out off the road, and as she notices the car, she gets up like it's no problem. The car passes, and then a guy that seems like her boyfriend appears out of nowhere. He's yelling at the girl like, "Oh babe, I'm glad you're okay." He's saying just random stuff and trying to get her to go with him. She doesn't seem afraid of him, but just as he notices my mum, he's at my mum's window practically instantly. He covered about 20 feet in what seemed like a split second. This whole ordeal was just too strange, so my mum just ended up speeding out of there, and once my mum made it back to my house, she called the police. They told her that they'd actually received 1 or 2 calls about this already that night, and they didn't act too concerned. As my mum told me this story, it just made my skin crawl. This all happened about a 10-minute walk from my house at most. I've never had any kind of problem in the 3 years that I've lived here, and nothing even close to this has happened since, but it was a strange one, that's for sure. To quickly preface my recent experiences, I believe it's important to know a few things. I'm a 27-year-old female. I've lived in my house going on 13 years now. The house belonged to my maternal grandparents, and my family moved in originally to help take care of my ill grandmother. She, unfortunately passed away 3 years ago, but we continue to stay to help take care of my grandfather now. My grandfather is the second person to have ever owned this house. The couple previously, they bought it when it was built in the 70s and only stayed for a few years before moving away. The point of all this being that my house does not have any extensive history since my family has no more or less been the only people to ever live here. But I must admit though that I've never really liked living here. We moved in at the end of my sophomore year of high school, and since day one, I've always been just uncomfortable. My home is a breeding ground for negativity. To avoid airing out all the details of my family's personal issues though, I'll just say that tension is always high in my house. People are constantly fighting, and mental illness runs rampant in my bloodline too. The air is just thick with aggression and suffocating amounts of stress all the time. It's no surprise to me that paranormal stuff happens here. So, it started out with small things, like hearing someone call my name when no one had, finding lights turned on when they were off, seeing things in the corner of my eye, items going missing and then appearing again suddenly, or feeling a sort of cold chill on the back of my neck, like someone is behind me, but nobody's ever there. Truthfully, I didn't pay too much mind to that stuff. Sure, I found it odd, but not creepy enough to keep me up at night or anything. But then, 2013 happened. I started having these sort of insomnia episodes all of a sudden. I've had bouts of insomnia before, but this was different. It was as if my body just wouldn't let me sleep, like it was waiting for something. It started to be that late in the night, I would also smell something burning. Not like that campfire smell or the aroma of cooking, but like something was actively on fire. The first time I smelt it, I jumped up immediately and ran throughout my whole house to check and make sure that it wasn't burning down with everyone unaware. It's a small single-floor home with no basement and only a crawl-space attic, so I got through it pretty quickly, checking every single room. I touched the walls and I touched the ceilings to feel for any heat, but there was nothing. I looked outside to check neighboring houses and our shed, all the while with the intense smell of fire lingering in the air, but still I didn't see anything. But the smell was so strong I felt like I was choking on it, until suddenly, after a few minutes, it just disappeared. This continued to happen for weeks straight as well. Every night the smell would come to me, and every night I would begin my routine of checking my house again. I got so paranoid, in fact, that something was actually going to be on fire that I wouldn't allow myself to just ignore it. I began doing nightly walks around outside of my house to check every possible place for a fire, but never saw a thing. Now, about 2 weeks into my nightly walkthroughs, I began to notice these sort of small sparks of light on the ceilings that would follow me through the rooms. The light was like a dying sparkler, a small burst of brightness that would travel above my head as I walked. The light didn't appear every night and only manifested when I would smell the fire. The light also would never follow me into my room when I had completed my nightly rounds. But during this time, the frequency of whispers that I would hear during the day and things going missing increased. And then I began to hear like soft sighs and whimpers outside of my window at random times of the day. Not identifiable as an animal or a person, but once again I would check with no discoveries. These activities, though weighing heavily on my mental well-being, grew mundane and somewhat predictable. Things, however, grew worse in time when I began seeing the people. The first was the little girl in my kitchen. One night I headed out to grab myself a snack, and as I turned the corner to step into my dark kitchen, the clear figure of a girl stepped directly in front of me in the doorway. Although there were no recognizable features, I knew straight away that she was a child with long hair and wearing a dress from her silhouette. I'm only 4'10", and she was at least a full foot shorter than me. She approached me so closely and so suddenly that I sort of gasped, and I instantly reached for the light switch to my right, and not breaking my eye contact with her dark shape, I watched as she vanished right before me when I flicked the light on. Another was the man that stood in the corner of my room. I only really started noticing him after the little girl. For many nights, I kept him in the corner of my eye, never daring to look directly at him. He wasn't there every night, though, and he wasn't there all the time. He wasn't there until, well, he was. And he was there until, well, he wasn't. What I mean is that there was just no continuity in his appearances. He was only ever there when I was laying in bed, and always only in the far right corner of my room. Eventually, I got the courage to look directly at him. Once again, no distinguishable features other than a masculine build, or roughly 5'10" if I had to guess, and he wore a hat, which was weird. When I'm laying down, my feet are sort of in line with the door to my room directly in front of me, but his body was always angled perpendicular, facing the door rather than me. And although his presence did make me nervous, he never really moved. Truthfully, the only one who terrified me was the man at the end of my bed. He frequented more than this little girl, but less than the man in the corner. But one strange thing too about this one is that I always was able to feel him before I saw him. Looking at him made me dizzy, so I tried my best to keep my eyes closed until I felt like he was gone. He was tall, slender, and most distorted out of them all. He always stayed at the foot of my bed though, but it varied if he was directly in front of me or not. Occasionally he would lean over, sometimes a little, sometimes a lot, but he was always just sort of staring at me. I really don't like to think about him. It makes my stomach sink and my chest sort of heavy. But for months in the year of 2013, my nights consisted of variations of all these events. A few times, all three even appeared to me on the same night, and only once did the two men appear to me at the same time. But just as quickly as everything had begun, eventually it just stopped. I didn't see them anymore. I didn't smell the fire or see the lights on my ceiling. I always have and probably always will hear the whispers, though. But it's obviously 2020 now, and my life has changed, well, a lot since then. I put myself through many years of college, I established my career, got a great job, and I've been saving for my future. But something has changed over the last 2 months. You see, during this pandemic, I've been laid off and have spent the last month and a half almost entirely at home. About 3 weeks ago, I saw this little girl again, but this time, she was in the reflection of the mirror at the end of my hallway. The mirror is floor to ceiling in length, and although it was during the day, the hallway was dark. And she was just sort of standing behind me in the reflection, but when I turned around, she obviously wasn't there. Twice last week, too, a cool shiver was running down the length of my spine, and it woke me instantly from my sleep. Occasionally, I'll feel this presence at the nape of my neck when I walk through my house, and just 3 nights ago, I saw him again. When I sensed him at first, I thought that I was going to pass out. My stomach turned and my vision blurred again. When I finally allowed myself to look, there he was. Only this time, not at the end of my bed where I thought that he was going to be, but on the side of me, and this time, a lot closer. I honestly wanted to cry so badly, but was so frightened that I could only really hold my breath for what seemed like an eternity. And when I had felt that he was gone, I quickly rushed to turn my lights on, and again, there was nobody there. I'm filled with nothing but dread and anxiety. Every night since then, I sleep with my lights on, and even though I'm doing everything in my power not to see them again, I just can't help but notice when they're around. I don't know why they came to me last time, and I don't know why they're coming to me now, but most importantly, I don't know how to make it stop. Do any of you guys have any ideas?
Hey, support the show by going to eeriecast.store and buying some merch. And bookmark that page too, because pre-orders will be opening sometime next year for our upcoming special edition novel and my new card game, Cryptid. Thank you.
Hi, to dead and roasted. What can I get you?
I hate trash duty. It stinks, and garbage always flies all over the place. But if we don't feed the trash god in the dumpster, he'll come out again, and good lord, we don't want that. Hey, welcome back to the break room. I hope you're ready for some new allegedly true scary work stories. I've got tales this week about peekaboo ghosts and psycho escapees. Grab us a coffee and sit back. These are tales from the break room. The Kid and the Nurse, from Panda Marine. I was talking with my colleagues and friends about paranormal activities during my night shift back when I was an intern. A certain story creeped me out. This happened in a 4 or 5 story hospital. I can't remember exactly because I only worked at the ground level. During midnight, there was one nurse going down the levels via the ramp, which we used for those rolling beds. The ramp goes up to all floors since the hospital is old and doesn't have an elevator. Along the way, she found this kid, about 5 to 8 years of age. They were lost somewhere on the 2nd floor. The kid exclaimed that he was looking for his mama. After trying to find out where the kid had lost his mom, the nurse understood that he was describing the patient rooms at the 4th and 5th floor. So she escorted the kid just about a corner away from the nurse's station, telling him to talk to the nurses to locate his mom. She couldn't help him further as she was in a hurry to go downstairs for an emergency. The kid listened and went to the nurse's station, and she left for the bottom floor. As she arrived at the bottom floor, she asked the other nurses where the emergency was, and they directed her to the bed, saying that it was too late for the patient. The doctor had already declared the patient dead. She proceeded to the bed where the doctor was. Lo and behold, by the doctor was that dead patient, a child wearing the exact same outfit as the one she escorted to the nurse's station. I was frankly creeped out by this story, but I hoped it was probably just a story. It was a story that was passed on from colleague to colleague until it finally reached me. The proper full detail of the story has been lost by then. I can't even remember why the kid died or why he was in the hospital. I grew up in a third world country. Folks tend to be a little superstitious there. We have a lot of beliefs ranging from ghosts to demons and whatnot. It's usually a cautionary tale to make folks keep safe, to keep them away from the dark, to keep walking on the beaten path to avoid getting lost or worse, killed. But it's not rare to hear stories about ghosts in places where death is commonplace, like hospitals. There is no warning or message from this story of the kid and the nurse, except maybe on a personal level. Perhaps to some, it's the story of a loved one who doesn't want to cross to the afterlife yet. Others may see it as the constant life of healthcare professionals who battle against the jaws of death to keep people alive. Or maybe it's a symbol of the fear of death itself, that, in a way, the dead won't know they're dead. Warning: the following story contains mentions of assault. Stalker in the Woods, from Vladimir. The property I work at has a decent number of trees along the back. Some might even call it a mini forest. Within those woods are numerous animals, from deer to coyote. I've even seen foxes, bats, turkeys, and vultures. When I was first moved to third shift, the main thing I was told was to be aware of my surroundings when I was outside. At first, I was on high alert when I would take the trash out. The idea of meeting a coyote during my garbage run wasn't thrilling, even if a small part of me wanted to see one. After a while, when nothing happened, I lowered my guard and forgot about the warning. That was until my boss told me the animals weren't what I needed to watch out for. Apparently, people like to venture into those woods, and they enjoy causing problems for security. The reason she told me this was because on one of my nights off, a group of men came on the property and stole some air conditioners. Out there, every little sound made me pause. I would even hold my breath until I knew there was nothing there. As time went on and nothing happened, the warning erased itself from my mind. My work has a few sister locations, one of them being about a 10 to 20 minute walk from the back parking lot. The residents in that house are more mobile and more dangerous. If they weren't mentally disabled, they would be in jail. After learning this fact, you would think my boss's warning would have returned to me, but it didn't. It was either late 2018 or early 2019 when something happened that would make me remember. The dumpster company who empties our compactor had come late, so first and second couldn't take out the trash that day. The first half of my night was taking the 2 shifts garbage out myself. Eventually, it began to rain. I was elbow deep in garbage and soaking wet. You'd better believe I was angry. At one point, I started to cuss out loud, angrily throwing the trash away. I even kicked at the dumpster out of rage. Halfway done, though, I shut up, because something felt off. I had that feeling of eyes staring into my back, and it made me tense up. Had security caught me making a scene? I turned around, but I discovered I was alone. I couldn't figure out why I felt like someone was watching me. Ignoring it, I went back to tossing bags into the compactor, then went back inside. Stepping off the elevator, I was greeted by 3 East's floor supervisor. She asked me about all the trash, specifically third shifts, since no one had been able to pull it. With a sigh, I gave up and began doing my shift's trash. No sense waiting on it now, I thought. After 3 East, I made my way to 3 West, where I saw a resident staring out the kitchen window. That was odd, because she should have been asleep by then. I silently walked past, and I began to open the trash can. But I jumped when she grabbed my sleeve, taking me right out of my thoughts. "Oh, what is it, honey?" I asked. Her reply was simply to point. I glanced out and only saw rain and trees in that direction. Her finger then moved along the glass only to stop at what I assumed were the bushes. "There," she finally said. "Get it." Thinking she meant an animal, I nodded. "All right, I'll go get it. Just let me get the trash first," I answered. Satisfied with that answer, she walked back to her room. Luckily, the rain had died down when I made it back outside. A few feet away was a group of deer grazing. I've been able to gain a little trust with the deer at work, as I never bothered them when I'm out there and they never run off when they see me. They'll even come within a few inches near me, and as long as I don't make a sudden movement, they don't run away. That night was no different. They saw me and immediately went back to eating after I said a simple hello. As soon as I opened the squeaky door to the dumpster, I felt as if someone was staring at me again. Convincing myself it was one of the deer, I started to toss the trash inside. I then carefully closed the blue bin we used to escort garbage outside so as to not scare the deer. Then I scanned the area, but I couldn't shake that feeling that someone was watching me. Please just be deer, I thought to myself. At some point they had moved closer to me, but none of them were looking at me. All of their eyes were locked on the woods. Their bodies appeared positioned to run if needed. I immediately became nauseous. Was it coyotes? The deer would have run by now if it was coyotes, right? The sound of falling tree limbs breaking filled the area, which meant whatever was in there was closer than I hoped. At that point, the deer scattered, which meant it was time for me to go back inside. As I quickly pushed the blue bin, I heard the rustling of trees and bushes as if something was running. My power walk turned into a run. I got back inside and nervously waited for the door to shut, making sure it was locked. Suddenly, a message came over the intercom. "The building is on lockdown. No one is allowed in or out. I repeat, we are on lockdown until further notice." Lucky me, I didn't have to finish the trash that night. I wasn't 100% sure what the lockdown was for, though. I told security about what happened when I was outside, just in case it helped. Turns out, that was related to what had happened. At 7 a.m., I found out the full story. I found out how lucky I had been. One of the residents from the sister location, 20 minutes away, had escaped. He was one of the dangerous ones. He loved fighting, and usually wouldn't stop until you weren't moving anymore. He also loved to physically assault people, if you catch my drift. It didn't matter what gender you were. If he got the urge, he'd force you down. And his favorite victims were people he thought were showing off, and to him that was people who cussed, threw tantrums, or beat up objects out of rage. Exactly what I'd been doing out there when he was lurking about in the woods. What if? From Jason R. I've shared one of my more memorable moments during my time as a detention deputy here already. At that time, I thought hearing an ethereal voice in the middle of an empty building would be the scariest moment of my life. But that fear came in the moment. As it would turn out, there's something even more frightening. A fear that comes half a month after something has happened. Something that seemed at the time to be pretty innocuous. As innocuous something could be in that profession. I'd been with the sheriff's office for a couple of years, and I was a wreck. I hated waking up and getting dressed for work. I spent 12 hours waiting in agony for the vestibule door to open and for my relief to walk in. When I got off work, I needed something to make the heck I sat through somehow seem worth it. In my case, this something was shiny, plastic, and expensive. I loved collectibles. I couldn't get enough of them. I loved them to the point of sheer stupidity. And as it would turn out, I loved them to the point that I pointlessly, unknowingly put my life in jeopardy. Worse still, I put the life of the person I love most in the world in jeopardy as well. Here's where things get crazy. I mean, stupid. I'd actually work overtime so I could buy pricier junk. Normally, this overtime was just a few extra hours. But still, considering how much I hated the place, it was stupid. It was a vicious cycle. Hate my work, buy something worthless to make it seem worth it, hate work even more. But that junk never filled the hole. I always needed pricier junk, so I worked even more. A vicious, idiotic circle. Now, each jail comes with a clinic. In a jail, clinics are essential. One day, the oncoming shift needed a deputy to sit on an inmate in the clinic. Now, in jail speak, sit means you stand guard over one inmate, not literally sit on them. This duty assignment is unique, usually reserved for suicidal inmates, or in this case, inmates that are hospitalized. This probably doesn't come as a surprise, but more than a few inmates come into jail with severe problems. One of the most difficult things I had to watch were men going through DTs. When a person is forced to detox off of whatever they're on, be it alcohol or hardcore drugs, it's brutal. There's always screaming, crying, shaking, vomiting. I'll stop there, but it does go on. Anyway, the deputies on my shift were just as much in a hurry to leave as I should have been. All I got was a brief rundown on the guy I was supposed to watch, an African-American male in his late 20s. He shouldn't get up or do anything. He's pretty wasted. Hearing that he was that wasted led me to believe he was coming down off something. As it would turn out, he wasn't. I unfolded what was left of my book and sat down. The guy I was watching was a mess. He was covered in what could best be described as bed sores. I'll save you the gory details. Now I considered myself a decent deputy. Not because I could lay someone out, but because I could talk them down. This guy suddenly regained consciousness, with a vengeance. He stood right up and walked around flailing his arms before losing his footing and bouncing off his bunk. I was gloved up, so I didn't hesitate to scoop him up and help him get back into bed. Keep in mind, he had wounds all over his body. Several of them had opened up. It was quite unpleasant. He got up a couple of other times during the time I watched him. Both times, I told him to get back into bed, telling him the nurses were going to check in on him and he needed to keep still. Thankfully, he listened. 4 hours later, I was relieved, in more ways than one. I stripped off my latex gloves and went home, taking a shower and going to bed. I used that overtime money to go out to someplace nice to eat, or bought something I didn't need. A week or so later, I found out that guy had gotten into 2 dust-ups. Well, if you could call them that. Mainly, he had tried to stand up and swing on one of the deputies before falling again. Shortly after that, he became bedridden. Then, not long after that, he died from AIDS. No one had told me he was HIV positive. I didn't find out until 2 weeks later. As soon as I discovered this, I made sure my wife and I were both tested, and thank God we were both negative. 2 whole weeks I could have been an oblivious time bomb, one that could have ruined both our lives. I was a newlywed. My coworkers knew I was married, but not one of them bothered to warn me that he had AIDS. What if he had swung on me, hit me, busted my skin, and got his blood on me? My stupidity and the negligence of my coworkers could have caused my wife and I to contract a deadly disease. As time wore on with this job, the constant stress, fear, and sheer anger from it strained my relationship with my wife. She would later tell me that it had gotten so bad, she felt we were either going to get a divorce or I was going to wind up dead. So I made the best decision I could. I moved on, I went to college, and I never looked back. Not until later, that is. Whenever I think of my time behind those walls, a cold chill goes up my spine. When I think about all the what-ifs and look over at my beautiful wife, it terrifies me to this very day. I have trouble sleeping. I have since around 2001, and I'll probably have trouble sleeping for the rest of my life. So why tell you all this? Because there are things far more terrifying than some otherworldly paranormal monster hiding behind the corners of an abandoned building. One such terror is that of a sick man getting treated in a hospital, lying right in front of you in a brightly lit room. Rona Ghost, from Damien Y. When Corona hit the US back in late 2019, I was working at a small hospital in a rural central Minnesota town. I worked the night shift, 10:30 p.m. to 7 a.m. I was a phlebotomist at the hospital. I've worked in the healthcare field in various capacities and held various titles the last 25 years. I was used to working those hours and seeing weird things at night. But this experience was by far the weirdest, and I experienced this event with another person. It was mid-May 2020. The hospital reached COVID peak. Every room in the hospital was occupied by COVID patients. Since we were a small hospital, we only had 6 ICU beds. Of those 6 rooms, only 1 room came with an air filtration system. This room was our designated tuberculosis infection room for patients with active TB. By this time in the pandemic, it was clear that every room needed to have air filtration systems. We were in the process of installing the systems, which took time. So the worst patients were put in this one room for a couple of days. When they got better, we put them in a regular room. The COVID patients were rotating in and out of the ICU room, ICU 1. That particular morning, I was called to go draw the patient in ICU 1. Normally, we have a morning round, which started at 5:30, but the charge nurse wanted results for this patient before 5 a.m. She was making arrangements with an outside hospital for a possible transfer. After gowning up, I entered ICU 1. The room was larger than the other rooms on that floor because of its TB designation. And because of COVID, every furniture item in the room had been removed. The only things in the room were the patient in his bed, the 2 IV poles, a stainless steel hospital tray, and one of those PVC pipe chairs that the patient could sit on over a toilet. I turned on all the lights in the room. The curtain that normally covered the double sliding doors was pushed to one side. The room was bright and visible to anyone in the hallway. I introduced myself to the patient. He was awake, and he acknowledged my presence. He was already in a sitting position on his bed, so I didn't have to incline his head. I went ahead and pulled his bed up to my waist so I didn't have to bend down. This patient was an overweight man in his 60s. He wore an oxygen mask. The sound of the hissing oxygen was the background noise in the room. The air filtration system also made a low humming, continuous sound in the room too. Now, because he was a big man, it was difficult to find a vein in his left arm. In his right arm, he had 2 IV lines with running medication and fluids, so that arm was not suitable for a blood draw. So I continued to search for a vein in his left arm. The whole time, he watched me. We made eye contact a couple of times. I calmly told him what I was doing. Then, suddenly, the patient looked away towards the foot of his bed, as if a person had entered the room, taking his attention away from mine. I turned to look as well. A figure was standing there. I got the sense it was a female. They were slender, wearing blue hospital scrubs. I could tell her hair was blonde. As all this information formed in my head, I also knew that the figure was not real. The sliding door was closed as I had left it closed, and I had not heard a single person enter behind me. And the figure was not gowned up for room entry. I did a double take just in case, because the face was blurry, and I thought maybe my face shield was making me see weird reflections. I adjusted the shield. The figure was still there facing me. I didn't recognize it. I'd worked there for 13 years, and I knew just about everyone on that night shift. I looked at the patient then, and they looked at me. We stared at each other for a brief second as we both tried to comprehend the new entity in the room. Then I turned back to the figure, but it crouched down and disappeared. From where I stood beside the bed and the foot of the bed was only an arm's length away. I pulled the tourniquet loose from the patient's arm, pulling up the bedside rail and telling the patient to hold on for a second. Then I looked under the bed. I rounded the bed to the other side and looked under the bed again. Then I walked to the sliding door, peeking out into the darkened hallway. No one was there. There was no one out there at the nurse's station midway down the hall. I turned back to the room, just standing by the door, looking in. The room was bright. There was no place in it to hide. I surveyed the whole room still from one end to the other, and as I did, my patient watched me, his eyes wide. He was talking, but with the oxygen mask on, it was hard to understand what he was saying. After I was sure there was no one else in the room with us, I returned to the bedside and continued with the procedure. Then it happened again. The figure rose at the end of the bed. The patient's head swiveled to stare at the figure, and I did too. The figure ducked down again. I pulled the tourniquet, untied it from the patient's arm, quickly took a step back, and ducked down to see if I could catch the prick. Nothing. I stood there. My nerves were rattled a bit by then. I looked at my patient, sighed, and said, "I don't know what's going on, but I really do need to get your blood before the nurse bites my head off." I then returned to my task. Finally, I found a good vein. I concentrated on it, but I felt the presence of the figure at the foot of the bed. I felt it watching me. I wasn't nervous about being watched. I was very focused on getting the blood. The vein was very small. If I let my nervousness take over, I would have to start over. I would have to stay in that room even longer. And at that point, I was going to do everything within my power to get out of there as fast as possible. Halfway through the blood draw, the patient's gaze turned back to the foot of his bed. Without moving my head, I glanced sideways, and I saw the figure there. It was playing hide and seek with me. I was starting to feel uneasy, but mostly, I didn't want to have to poke the patient again. I put all my concentration into finishing the blood draw. After I was done, I labeled the blood tubes, taped up the patient, put his bed down, and patted the man's arm. Before turning to go, I said, "I'm sorry, I don't know what that was, but that was strange." The man only shrugged his shoulders at me. We stared at each other for a long few seconds. Then I exited the room, turned off the lights, degowned, and returned to the lab. I didn't feel the full effect of chills until I made it to the lab. I had no idea what that was. I didn't sense any malice in the entity's presence. But this wasn't the first time I experienced unexplainable occurrences at the hospital. And I never found out if that patient lived or died. Whenever I had to go back to that ICU room to do blood draws on patients, this event played back in my mind, making the hair on my neck stand up. My compilation of odd experiences. From Ami Dolari. I am a female doctor in the spectrum, and as of now, I have worked in different places, both hospitals and clinics. And let me tell you something, there are tons of creepy sightings, either by workers, patients, or their families. Allow me to share some with you. The following few stories all happened at a hospital that I worked at. One night I was working on the computer at the doctor's lounge, making some follow-up notes on my patients. My coworkers were there as well. We were all cheerfully chatting and joking when a nurse came into the room and said, "I think the patient in bed 369 is having a heart attack. Can someone go check?" As I hadn't finished my work yet, my friends told me to stay, check the record, and they would call if they needed me. So I did that. They left the room and I immediately checked on the system to see what kind of patient we were dealing with. To my surprise, there was no one listed under bed 369. I must have misheard that bed number, I thought. So I sent a text to our group chat. Multiple people answered, 369. Weird, I thought. A few minutes passed and I didn't hear from them again. Suddenly, my phone buzzed with a text. Someone else was asking for clarification on the bed number. I was puzzled. I texted back that it was 369. We'd all heard the same number, so we couldn't all be wrong, right? After some time, they came back and said there wasn't anyone in that bed. Someone even checked with the nurse station. They said there wasn't any patient in that bed since the day before, and at the moment, there was no patient in need of a doctor. When my friend described the nurse who called for assistance, the nurses at the station were all confused. There was no nurse employed here that matched that description. We were all perplexed and a bit annoyed because it was probably just a prank, but we never did figure it out for sure. Probably just a joke. I always had good luck, so my shifts would always be nice and quiet. On one night in particular, I was incredibly bored, so I went to the nurses' station to find someone to chat with. There, I found some nurses who were also bored as they finished their work, so I asked them about their scary experiences around the hospital. They all looked at each other and they say, "Yeah," in unison. "Do you really want to know?" one of them asked. "Of course," I responded back, eagerly. They all laughed at me. One of them said, "Okay, Doc, I've got one for you. During my first week working in here, my mentor told me this story to scare me. I thought she was trying to get me to quit, but she had a serious face while telling me." She continued to explain. Back in the 1950s, there was an inpatient at this very hospital named Jane. She fell extremely ill out of nowhere. Doctors could not understand what was going on. Several tests were conducted. Some empiric treatments were given. But there was no improvement to her condition. As the days went by, the woman kept getting worse and worse, but at the same time, things began to happen on the floor her room was on, the third floor. The lights would go off at random times, then go back on. At some point, The other patients began to say they heard screams in the halls, but when the nurses would go and check, there would be no one to be found. No source to the screams. Later on, Jane stopped eating too. Her health worsened, but also the things got worse too. The patients around her would complain about screams, but now, somehow it all came from within Jane. People reported hearing 3 or 5 different voices coming from her throat. She would move and her bones would crack, making terrible noises. Her body would contort into awkward and unnatural positions. She would vomit blood and cry out loud for God to help her. But she never did receive the right help. Apparently, medicine and science couldn't help her. Her family asked for a priest to ask God to help her soul, either to save her or to end her pain. When the priest arrived, all the lights went out and horrible screaming would burst from within her, guttural, horrible screams. She said, Leave now. I can't take it. It doesn't want you here." She would squirm violently with pain. At some point, the priest got up and left, arguing that his presence there was not helping her condition. She needed special help, so he would ask his superiors for the authorization to perform an exorcism. Sadly, she didn't hang on that long. She died from organ failure due to chronic bleeding. At least, that was what the report said, but the nurses back then said her body just wouldn't hold what was in her. When the nurse finished that story, I was astounded. I lightheartedly said, "Let me guess, she was in the West Wing." "How do you know?" she asked. "Just a guess. That side of the hospital always gives me the creeps," I responded, remembering the thing about bed 369. "Well, you're right. She was in bed 360 or something along those lines." I didn't have time to properly think about what she said when another nurse added, "My turn to scare the doctor." And so she began her story. "I worked in the ER for a long time when I was younger, but my feet can't handle that anymore. I appreciate the calmness around here." She stopped herself. As context, at the hospital, it's pretty much forbidden to say calm when describing a shift because things can get pretty hectic out of nowhere. Everyone just stared daggers at her. "Anyway," she continued, "something that I'm pretty certain that did happen and probably still does in this hospital are the rounds from the nurse in black. I personally never saw her, but a lot of patients would tell me about her. They described her as always wearing her uniform, one exactly like ours, but all black. They would say that she was as beautiful as an angel, tall and slim, with perfect skin, green eyes, and long dark hair. She would sometimes appear walking from a door, checking on the patients inside, and she'd even talk to them. She would try to calm them, saying a little prayer, or simply uttering a few nice words. This wasn't a one-time occurrence. Multiple patients reported seeing her, and they would mention her with great fondness. Even our isolated patients sometimes mentioned seeing her. The thing is, there wasn't anyone that worked here that looked like that, and there is no black uniform allowed here. But the scary part is, the patients that prayed with her would die a few days after. Not from awfully scary things, but some of them were okay one day and the next their condition would worsen. As I said, I never saw her myself, but a coworker of mine swears he did. I don't want to know anything about her, to be honest. As she finished the story, they all nodded in an "I feel you" kind of way, which was probably the creepiest part. Then a young nurse that joined us halfway through said, "Oh, I have one too. Probably all of you have experienced this by now, but it just happened to me a few days ago. I feel like I need to get it off my chest," she said in a sheepish voice. "As some of you might know, I've been working here for a few months now. I've been stationed at the hematology department in the pediatric wing, and since I'm the newbie, I only get night shifts, so it's been crazy. I mean, I don't mind the long, boring hours, but the laughs. Man, those laughs. She grabbed her head in her hands. It's been too much sometimes. I hate scary movies because I'm so jumpy, so this sometimes feels like a bad joke from the universe. Sometimes things I leave in certain places will disappear and reappear somewhere else. Then I hear sounds, kids laughing at hours they shouldn't be playing, balls bouncing without anyone being around, the playground area moving on its own. Just the other day, the head nurse called me to her office because there was a complaint about some kids running in the hallway. When I told her I only had one kid admitted, whom I knew was sleeping with his mom at the time, she only told me to keep them quiet, then proceeded to send me on my way. What was I supposed to do? Ground a ghost kid for eternity? I'm ashamed to say I'm scared of my job. I mean, I love kids and all that, but not those kinds of kids. The nurses around her reassured her, and just like that, we finished our little storytelling session. By then, we had rounds to do. The days passed on, everything seemed normal, seeing normal patients, except for the woman who tried to hit me, saying we weren't even trying to fix her father, but she didn't understand that what we were doing was the proper treatment, and he was nearly ready to be discharged. But oh well. One night during my rounds, I asked one of my patients how she was feeling. She broke her hip, and due to her age and numerous illnesses, she wasn't a candidate for surgical repair of the damage. She said she was okay, but she was sick of the children. Obviously, I asked her what she meant. After all, there were no kids allowed in that area. Then she told me,
"The children, the kids that were making noises, loud noises. They were jumping and running around my bed, and when they saw you coming, they hid under the bed."
I knew there weren't any kids, because I would have seen them on the way in. But to make her happy, I checked under her bed. But I didn't see anything. I told her the kids weren't in here anymore. And that made her happy, I guess. I of course checked to see if she had other symptoms of delirium, a condition in which you'd sense things that aren't there, which was common in her state. But no, she seemed mentally fine beyond that. Curiously, they did bother her again. That wasn't the only time that patients complained about the children hiding under their beds. This happened at least 4 times in different floors and different wings. A few months later, I began working at an early stimulation center, a place for kids under 5 years old to develop their potential, and where rehabilitation was given to the ones who needed it, whether they needed help with their speech, movement, or anything else. It was pretty awesome what people did in there. In fact, every assignment was amazing, except mine. I would only check on kids or their parents if they were feeling sick, which meant a few runny noses per week if anything. So I'd always wander the halls trying to be useful in some way. I learned a lot about different kinds of therapy. I would always ask the therapists if I could observe their sessions and ask questions about their experience with one thing or another. That helped me keep going for a few months, and it was the reason I didn't quit earlier. One day I was scrolling through my phone when out of nowhere I heard someone screaming. Then I saw the head therapist running through the main hall while screaming at the top of her lungs. Of course, we all ran to see what was up. She was crying hysterically, but she managed to say between sobs, "I was finishing my paperwork, my room was all empty. Then out of nowhere I hear a little kid's voice say to me, 'Can we play?' I was confused, so I checked under my desk, even though I knew no one was there. Then I heard a ball bouncing a few feet away from me, so I ran, and here I am now." We were all astonished at her story. Just a few weeks after this, I was walking to a meeting that was about to start in the conference room. I then realized I forgot my phone in my office, so I quickly went back to grab it. But just as I was about to enter my office, I heard clear as day a child's voice say, "Doctor." I paid it no mind and grabbed my phone anyways, until I realized that since all the staff was in the meeting, and there was no children in the facilities at the time, I shouldn't be hearing a child's voice. So I started to check around to see where the voice came from. It sounded a lot like it came from the same room where the head therapist had gotten frightened. But the room was closed at the moment, and there was no one in there. There was a window pane in the door, so I could see inside, and the lights were all on, so it'd be obvious if someone was in there. But I didn't see a soul. At that point, I was thinking, weird. Later on, I asked the staff if there were any children for any reason in there, but I got the same answer from everyone. No. So if you ask me now, yes, a ghost talked to me, and the only thing I thought was, nope, probably not talking to me. After all, the voice said doctor. This was in Mexico, and the female term would have been doctora if referring to me, so I had assumed that they weren't talking to me. At some point in my life, I had to do some volunteering, as it was mandatory in order for me to graduate. Hence, I worked at a rural hospital as a medical resident for some time. It was an incredibly creepy place. Some rooms gave me the chills more than others, but they were all creepy, especially at night, since it had pretty bad lighting. I mean, that's probably the reason I saw shadows sometimes at the corner of my eye, right? It's quite normal to see shadows of people walking, even when I know for a fact no one else is around, I hope. That's probably the reason why I didn't even flinch when one of the nurses told me she took a selfie and saw a shadow person appearing in the image behind her. It was exactly that, the complete silhouette of a person standing right next to her. As we were looking at this creepy selfie and trying to see it better, her phone just died. Its battery was drained. Then of course she realized she didn't have her charger with her, which was just bad luck. The next time I saw her, I asked about the picture, and she told me she deleted it because her husband told her it was bad juju. A few nights after that, I was pretty busy, doing nothing during my shift. It was around 4 a.m., which meant I usually had nothing to do at the hour. People usually wait till the end of my shift to arrive. All alone and bored, I went to check if there was anyone waiting to be assigned to me. Plus, sometimes the guy at the registration office would fall asleep. When I got there, I saw a guy patiently waiting and sitting there. Excuse me, can I help you? I asked. Oh, hi, doctor, he answered in a cheerful voice. Yes, my brother is outside. I had a hard time getting him in the car. It's a small one, you know, and his leg is dangling in an awful, unnatural way. It hurts him too. His hip is broken or something, and any movement is too much pain for him. Can you please come out to the parking lot to check on him? I'm exhausted from all the acrobatics we had to do to get him inside the car. He finished with a smile. Now, that seemed weird. I mean, I wouldn't be smiling if my brother had a broken leg and was in pain. Also, his voice, it was overly sweet and calm. The best way I could describe it was a performance. As he said all of this, I was having a soliloquy in my head. I was thinking, yeah, dude, of course I would go outside to the dark parking lot without anyone else around. Would you like my phone and ID while I'm at it? I could even tie myself up for you too. Now, I may have some filter when I talk, but my face doesn't lie. I was never a good liar because my face always gave it away. As politely as I could, I said, Sir, it's forbidden that I go out while working. There are cameras everywhere and I could get fired. But he's in pain. Yes, but I can't even check on him in there, can I? I retorted, which was true. But I can't move him. It was a pain to get him in there. Just come with me, please, and see what it is, he said, beginning to lose his cool and fake sweetness. I'll get a nurse to help you, don't worry. A woman won't help much, he said. Don't worry, he is a big and strong guy, and he'll be able to do it without breaking a sweat. I then left, walking backwards as to keep an eye on him, and just as I did, he went outside. I calmly explained everything to my coworkers, and they went to check where I found the man. But he was gone. The car that had been in the parking lot was no longer there, but I did see the security guy doing his rounds. He came inside and I went over to talk to him. Right away, he told me please not to go outside. He explained he saw a shady guy waiting near a car while another man entered the clinic. Now, I might be wrong, doctor, but the guy standing outside was hiding in the dark by the car, and at some point, the one who went inside came rushing back out, and they both got in and sped away. I asked him, was there anyone inside the car? No, he responded. And the guy in the dark, did he seem injured or… I don't know, but he ran quite fast. Does that count? Yes, it did, because my intuition was correct apparently, and because I wouldn't probably be here writing this right now if I'd gone outside with that man. Thankfully, those days were over in a blink of an eye, and I went back to the city to work in a different clinic, which didn't have night shifts, thank God. In that place, I met a man who told me a weird story. I don't know if it's true, but he seemed to believe it. He didn't have any records of mental illness, and to be honest, I didn't think he was schizophrenic, nor a drug user or anything like it. He was just scared. Also, it didn't happen only to him, it happened to his wife too, according to both of them. This is what he told me. I think I'm going crazy. I don't know what to think. I might be losing my mind, I guess. When he started, he had a pained look on his face. I've been having some extremely odd nights for a few weeks now. It started as nothing and I thought I was overreacting. I even took my cat outside of my room at night and he'd cry all night to be let back inside. But it still didn't stop. I don't know, I just don't know. My wife and I were getting these marks on our skin that looked like scratches. We thought it was the cat, although he never did that before. But I guess he could have started at some point, right? But when I left him outside our room for a while, it got worse. We both would get scratches all over our bodies. My wife would get them deeper and larger. I just don't know how to help her. Things get moved from one place to another too, without us noticing at first. Then the sounds. Ugh, am I going crazy? That was a hard one for sure. I still don't know what to think of it, to be honest. I guess I wasn't the right help he needed. He seemed healthy according to the psych evaluation, so I want to believe what he was saying. When I met my girlfriend Nadia, we'd hang out all the time. We were a happy young couple, but then out of nowhere, boom, COVID. So as an excuse to be able to spend some time together during the pandemic, we worked from home some days. Since she's also an MD, we organized ourselves a room at her house as our station, and we'd attend phone calls or video chats with patients to do follow-ups. If needed, we would check on them in person, or refer them to the hospital. At first, nothing weird happened at her house, probably because we were too busy in our own little world. But I always felt uneasy at her house. I'm as awkward as I can be, so at first I thought that was it. When I visit her home, even now, sometimes I feel watched, like if something was looking over my shoulder. Plus, I sometimes feel this presence staring at me. It was and still is utterly creepy. I can't tell her these kinds of things because she gets super creeped out, and then she gets anxious. So to keep her sanity intact, I try to keep it all to myself. But not too long ago, Nadia asked me out of nowhere if I thought there was something at her grandma's, because that house always creeped her out. Therefore, I told her I did feel uneasy, especially towards one of the rooms. It feels kinda weird, I told her. It gives me goosebumps and I can't keep myself from staring at its closed door every once in a while. It just feels wrong. I don't know how to put it otherwise, I explained while remembering the feeling and shuddering. She stared at me for a moment, then replied, "Well, I'll tell you a story. It happened to my granny a few years back. I'm not quite sure if it's real or not, but she always looked scared when she tells this story. One night she was sleeping in her room when suddenly she felt a presence at the foot of her bed. She woke up thinking that one of her kids were there, waiting for permission to crawl into bed with her. Then she sat on the bed and tiredly rubbed her eyes. As she opened them, she saw some thing. There was what she described as a monkey-like creature with a tail that ended in a pointy arrow, and it had tiny horns. It stared at her with red glowing eyes. She yelled as loud as she could, and her eldest son came rushing up to the room. But when he came in, the thing was already gone. Ever since that day, she never slept in that room again, not once. I was speechless, trying to imagine all that. About to ask 100 different questions, then she asked me if I felt anything at her house. Since I was already hyped up on the subject, I told her how I always felt weird in the dining room, like if someone was staring at me from the living room, poking its head from the doorstep. As I told her this, her mom entered the room, and my girlfriend asked her if she felt anything supernatural in the house. Her mom told her exactly what I said, almost word for word. I think that her mom might be sensitive too. Months before this happened, my mother-in-law and I were preparing dinner, and we both heard a voice from the laundry room. It was some sort of scream. We both looked, and there was nothing. No one. We knew prior that it was empty, but we still checked anyway, and we still saw nothing. We stared at one another. Then she asked, "You heard that, right?" And I told her I did. I clearly did. On another occasion, something similar happened, but this time we heard the door opening and closing in my girlfriend's room. There was no one there again. Nadia was outside with her brother, so there was no one there to be opening and closing doors like that. So yeah, we just closed the door and kept prepping our dinner. Some time ago, I was in Nadia's room just hanging out, checking my phone. I began to hear some strange noises. It was subtle at first, so I automatically thought it was the current from the fan. No big deal. But then it grew a bit louder, so I turned my head to the place I heard it, and it stopped just as fast as it started. I still paid no mind to this, and I went back to my phone. But then I heard some weirder noise. It sounded like metal against metal, like if the USB cables from the chargers were rustling. So again, I looked up, yet I saw nothing weird. Of course, I got scared, thinking there might be some sort of uninvited guest, the kind that makes my heart pound, my skin crawl, and my blood rush, a mouse. The truth is, I'm a 5'6" baby when it comes to mice. When I told Nadia about it, it went like this. "Hey, I have to tell you something. I don't want you to get scared, but I can't keep this to myself anymore," I admitted, being as extra as I could. We joke like that all the time. She cut me off midway, saying, "I know, I didn't want to confront this nor acknowledge it, but I can't keep pretending it's not happening." I was like, dang, so she knows about it. She explained, "The other day when we were napping, I got really scared. I woke up due to some noise. It sounded like someone saying something. I don't remember if it was my name or your name it called, but I felt it in my ear, low but clear, and it tickled." When she said that, I opened my eyes like a deer in headlights. I mean, I was talking about a tiny mouse or maybe even a rat, not that. She looked at me sheepishly and scared all at once, so I told her it was probably just a nightmare. Yesterday, she was looking for something in her brother's room. She started to hear some weird noises in the room. Again, there was no one else there, nor in the house at all for that matter. Their chihuahua was soundly asleep, and there is only one bed and one closet inside that room. She told me it was super odd because it sounded like what monsters sound like in the movies, like a low and deep growl. Being completely honest, I don't know how to describe the sound it made. Did I mention that her father kept her grandfather's hospital bed in her room for a while after he passed? He had been average height, slim, sort of like what I perceive from the corner of my eye. I wonder if that has to do with anything. Or am I just crazy? Tales from the Break Room is a viewer-submitted podcast featuring allegedly true scary stories that happened on the way to, on the way from, or at work. If you want your story to be narrated on the show, send it to us at eeriecast.com/submit. As of April 14th, we're paying 3 cents per word for stories that are approved and make it onto the show. Submission does not guarantee approval or payment. For a limited time only, PayPal only. Tales from the Break Room is an EerieCast Network original podcast hosted by Darkness Prevails. You can follow him on Twitter at Dark Prevails, and you can hear thousands more stories read by him on our other show, Unexplained Encounters. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow and rate Tales from the Break Room on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. You can also enjoy plenty more horror-themed podcasts at eeriecast.com.